Welcome, welcome. You're here at OmniWizard. Today we present to you What If Harry Potter Was Worthy of Stormbreaker at Hogwarts. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Star That Fell on Privet Drive. The thing about living with the Dursleys was that you learned very quickly which battles were worth fighting. Not the ones about food. Vernon had established a hierarchy around the refrigerator that was essentially feudal in structure. And Harry had learned to eat enough at school meals before summer to carry him through the lean months. Not the ones about Dudley, who at 14 had developed both the vocabulary and the physique of someone twice his age and used both with equal enthusiasm. Not even the ones about Harry's room, which was still technically his bedroom but which Vernon periodically threatened to reclaim for storage, as if the word storage were a weapon and not just a word. The battles worth fighting were the ones about Hedwig. Uncle Vernon had a deeply irrational response to the owl that went beyond his general objection to anything magical. He flinched when her wings spread. He went pale when she clicked her beak. Twice over the years he had threatened to wring that bird's neck in the specific tone of someone who knew, on some animal level, that doing so would be the worst mistake of his life, and knew also that he had no rational explanation for why he knew this. The threat never went anywhere. It just hung there, ugly and toothless, and Harry let it hang. This was the summer before his 4th year, and Harry was 14 years old, and he had learned the map of the Dursleys' moods so thoroughly by now that navigating them was almost unconscious. The way you stop thinking about breathing even though you're always doing it. The particular texture of this summer was Dudley's diet. The school nurse had sent a letter home. Then the doctor. Then, in what Harry suspected had been the most alarming moment of Vernon Dursley's adult life, a second doctor with a very calm voice had sat across from Vernon and used the phrase morbidly obese with no emotional inflection whatsoever. The result was a refrigerator full of things that technically contained nutrients and a household atmosphere like a kettle that had been left too long on the heat. Dudley sulked through every meal. He stared at Harry's plate with a hunger that was probably literal, but felt almost philosophical. He spent his evenings watching television and eating raw carrots with the expression of a man who has survived a great atrocity and hasn't decided yet what to do about it. Harry stayed out of his way, which was easy enough. His room had the books Mrs. Figg had lent him, Muggle fantasy novels mostly, which was surreal given the circumstances of his life, and he had Hedwig on the good days, and he had his own thoughts, which were, if nothing else, his. He'd heard about the tournament. Hermione's letter, first week of June, had been careful the way she always was. I've found some references in Hogwarts, a history but very little detail. Something significant is being planned for this year. I've written to Professor McGonagall but she hasn't replied, which is itself interesting. Ron's letter, which had arrived the same day covered in Chudley Cannon stickers, had been considerably less careful. Harry, Dad knows something and he won't say what, but Bill came home last month and the two of them shut themselves in the shed for 3 hours. 3 hours. Whatever it is, it's going to be absolutely mental. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, relative silence. A torn corner letter from Ron that had mentioned tickets to something. The specifics smudged by what Harry strongly suspected was Uncle Vernon's thumb pressed directly to the parchment. Then thought better of. A postcard from Hermione, who was in France with her parents and had somehow managed to pack a book recommendation into the space above the stamp. Harry put the postcard on his windowsill and looked at it sometimes in the evenings, and felt the restlessness in his chest that he'd been feeling all summer. This specific pressing sensation, like something was building. He'd been attributing it to the tournament rumors, to Hermione's careful detective work, to the way the summer always felt like a held breath before Hogwarts exhaled and let the year begin. He was partly right, but only partly. The night it happened was an ordinary Tuesday in August. He knew it was an ordinary Tuesday because Aunt Petunia had served her Tuesday dinner, poached fish for Dudley's diet, with a side of steamed vegetables that no human being on earth had ever voluntarily enjoyed. And Vernon had spent the meal monologuing about something that had happened at the drill company, some interdepartmental power struggle Harry had been mentally filing under Not My Problem since approximately 1991. Harry had gone to bed at 10. Hedwig was out hunting. He'd left the window open, the summer night coming in warm and still and smelling of the same mowed grass and petrol that Privet Drive always smelled of, and he'd been reading for an hour and was perhaps 20 minutes from sleep when the world ended. Not ended, but the sound was close enough. It wasn't thunder. Harry knew thunder. He'd spent enough time outdoors during Hogwarts storms to have a detailed internal catalog of thunder. This was something that went through him rather than around him, the kind of resonance that lives below hearing and above feeling, the kind that doesn't arrive through your ears so much as through the whole architecture of your chest. The windows rattled. His lamp swayed on its cord. Something fell off his desk. He was at the window before his eyes were fully open. The back garden of number 4 Privet Drive had, as of approximately 10 seconds ago, ceased to exist in the form Vernon had spent 15 years constructing. The lawn, edged with a precision that spoke of real psychological investment, was gone, replaced by a fan of upturned earth that stretched from the back step to the far fence. The rockery was rubble. 2 rose bushes had become abstract concepts. The garden gnome Dudley had inexplicably been attached to since age 7 was nowhere visible, which was the one unambiguous improvement. In the middle of all of it, half sunk in the impact crater, something was glowing. Harry's brain did the thing it had learned to do over 3 years of genuinely dangerous education. It catalogued fast and moved on. Large crater, object at center, object glowing in a color that didn't map onto anything he had words for, object humming, a vibration he could feel even from the first floor window, low and constant and somehow patient, not threatening, patient. The neighboring houses were stirring. A light had come on at the Palkises, Piers's parents, who had always looked at Harry with the specific wariness of people who suspected something without being able to articulate it. Another light at the Joneses. The dog 3 doors down was going absolutely spare. Harry's bedroom door opened. He didn't turn around. He heard Vernon's breathing, the sharp, thick breathing of a man dragged from sleep into something his entire worldview wasn't equipped for, and then the floorboards as his uncle moved to the window, and then the silence as Vernon looked at what Harry was looking at. "Is that?" Vernon started. "I don't know yet," Harry said. "Did you number?" He turned from the window and picked up his jeans from the chair, stepping into them without the self-consciousness of a boy who'd been watched his whole life. "But I'm going to go find out." "You are not going out there." Harry looked at his uncle. He didn't say anything. He'd stopped arguing with Vernon somewhere around his 2nd year when he'd worked out that argument was a form of asking permission, and he'd stopped asking permission at roughly the same time. He just looked at him, steady and calm and 14 years old, and after a moment Vernon looked away. Harry pulled on his trainers and went downstairs. The back garden smelled like storms. Like the specific charged air that exists in the immediate aftermath of a lightning strike. Ozone and something older underneath it. Something mineral and deep. Like the smell of rock that hasn't been exposed to air in 1,000 years. Harry walked to the edge of the crater and looked in. The axe was about 3 feet long from the base of its handle to the top of its blade, which curved in a single clean sweep that was somehow both functional and beautiful in the way that very well-made tools can be. The blade itself was a dark metal Harry couldn't name. Not iron, not steel. Something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, but then return it, changed, colder, with a quality that made you feel like you were looking at something that had seen the inside of a star and come back out the other side. The handle was wrapped in dark cord, tightly wound in careful spirals from the base to where the blade began, slightly scorched at the ends in a way that suggested tremendous heat applied very recently, but the cord itself unfrayed and intact. And the markings. Along the blade's edge, and in a band around where the head met the handle, there were markings that weren't carved so much as integral. Like the veins of a leaf, like the rings of a tree, like something that had grown there as part of the process of the thing being made. They were the source of the glow, cycling through that impossible color. Harry kept trying to pin it down, kept coming back to not quite silver, not quite blue, not quite the color of moonlight on snow, and each time landing just short of a word for it. He looked at it for a long moment. The hum was clearer down here with only the displaced earth between him and the object. It was patient. That was the overwhelming quality of it, patience, as if it had been going somewhere for a very long time and had arrived, and was content to wait now that it had. Harry crouched at the edge of the crater. He wasn't afraid. He thought about whether he should be afraid, the way you consciously run through a checklist when something is strange enough to warrant it, and the answer came back, number not afraid, curious, alert, something else he didn't have a name for yet. He reached into the crater and closed his hand around the handle of the axe. Years later, when he was older and had more language for things, Harry would describe the moment as something like recognition. Not the dramatic recognition of a lost memory recovered, not the thunderclap of revelation, just the quiet, settling certainty of the right key in the right lock. A click that wasn't a sound. The axe was warm, exactly as warm as a human hand, and the weight of it was exactly the weight it should be, and when he lifted it from the crater it came without resistance, as if it had never been buried at all, as if the earth had just been keeping it safe until he arrived. The markings flared. Not violently, not as an explosion of light, but as a lamp turned up slowly, the way you increase brightness to see a room properly. The impossible color filled the garden, the wall, the back of the house. It lit Harry's face from below and threw his shadow long across the ruined lawn. The hum moved up through his hand, his arm, his chest, and settled somewhere central, somewhere that felt important. He stood in the crater with the axe in his right hand and breathed. He didn't feel powerful. That was what surprised him then and later. He'd been in moments of magical intensity before, dueling Quirrell in the chamber on the shore of the lake with the Patroness, and they'd all felt like force, like pressure building and releasing. This felt like the opposite. Like something that had been pressing outward from inside him. His whole life had found a door and the door had opened, and now it didn't need to press anymore. It just existed, breathed. He'd been carrying something, he realized, something he'd never been able to name. And now, standing in the ruins of his uncle's garden in the Surrey dark, he thought, oh, so that's what that was. The back door slammed open hard enough to bounce off the wall. Vernon came out in his dressing gown, a dark green thing that had seen better decades, with his hair at war with itself and his face cycling rapidly through the repertoire of expressions Harry had spent 14 years cataloging. Shock. Outrage. The specific fear of a man encountering magic he can't dismiss. More outrage, because outrage was Vernon's default state, the way a compass defaults to north. He stopped when he saw Harry standing in the crater, holding something that was glowing in a color that didn't belong in Surrey. Boy, he said in the quiet voice that meant the yelling was pressurizing somewhere below the surface and would arrive shortly. Put that down. No, Harry said. He wasn't being defiant, he was being accurate. Putting it down wasn't something he was going to do. Vernon went through several shades of red in quick succession. That is not yours. I think it is, Harry said. I think it's been mine for a while, actually. This was a strange thing to say. Harry wasn't entirely sure why he'd said it, except that it felt true in the same way the click had felt true, settled and certain and resistant to argument. This is magic, isn't it? Vernon's voice had dropped below the yelling register entirely, which was not an improvement. More of your nonsense. Something fell from the sky into your garden, Harry said, clearly and without heat. It didn't do that because I asked it to. I don't know where it came from or why it landed here, but I picked it up and I'm keeping it, and I'd like to go back to bed. He paused. The neighbors are going to ask about the garden. I'd tell them it was a meteor, it's not far wrong. He climbed out of the crater, not with difficulty, with the easy movement of someone carrying something that is perfectly balanced for them, and walked back toward the house. Vernon didn't step aside, not immediately, and Harry stopped in front of him and waited with the patience of someone who has learned that the moment always resolves if you don't escalate it. Vernon stepped aside. Harry went upstairs. He propped the axe against his bedroom wall. In the dark, with only the ambient streetlight coming in, its glow turned his room into something else entirely, all the ordinary furniture given depth by that quiet, impossible light. He lay on his bed and looked at the ceiling, and then looked at the axe, and then looked at the ceiling again. Why me? He said. The glow pulsed. Once, slow and deliberate like a heartbeat. He lay there for a long time, listening to the neighborhood settle, listening to the dog 3 doors down finally give up and go quiet, listening to Vernon's footsteps going back to the bedroom, and the murmur of his aunt's voice asking questions and Vernon's responses, low and terse. He listened to the ordinary sounds of a summer night in a suburban street, a car passing, a cat doing what cats do, the distant drift of music from someone's open window. His hand rested on the floor beside the bed, 3 inches from the handle of the axe, not gripping, just near. He slept. The next morning he woke early and sat on the floor with the axe across his knees and paid attention. This was something he'd learned to do with magic. Not to force it, not to perform it, but to pay attention to it. Hermione understood magic through research and theory and the application of rigorous method. Harry understood it through attention and instinct and the specific willingness to sit with something until it told him what it was. They were different approaches, and they were both right, and they worked better together than separately, which was one of the reasons the 3 of them had survived this long. The axe told him things through sensation. Not words, not even close to words, but information carried the way music carries emotion without the intermediary of language. When he was calm and still, the weight of it was solid and settled, like holding something that belonged to the earth. When a spike of anger moved through him, he thought deliberately of Dudley's fist in his ribs at age 9, of Vernon's face the night he'd locked Harry's school books away. The axe went warm, and there was in the warmth the quality of readiness, not rage, not destruction. The warmth of a thing that understands its purpose and is waiting to be used correctly. He thought about Hermione. The axe went neutral, the way a tool rests when you're thinking rather than working. He thought about the Dementors on the train in 3rd year, the way the cold had reached into him and started pulling out the worst things, his parents' voices, his mother's scream, and the axe went warm again, but differently this time. Not the warmth of readiness. Something closer to the warmth of comfort, like being held steady. Harry sat with that for a while. Then he held his hand out to the side, away from the axe, several feet between his palm and the handle, and thought, come. The axe crossed the distance in less than a second, not gently. It hit his palm hard enough that he nearly dropped it, and the impact shocked a laugh out of him, and then he felt the adjustment, the axe recalibrating, the way a dog that jumps too hard learns to tone it down, and sat with it humming in his grip. Okay, he said, too fast, let's work on that. He spent the next 2 hours doing nothing but calling it from across the room, catching it, putting it back down. By the end he could summon it without flinching. By the end of the second day, he could do it without looking. By the end of the third day, he could do it with his eyes closed and one hand behind his back. And he couldn't explain how except that it felt like the axe had learned the map of him, had worked out the distance and the angle and the right amount of force. He went into the garden on the fourth morning. Vernon had covered the crater with a blue tarpaulin and was refusing to look at it, which was essentially Vernon's approach to all problems that exceeded his capacity for resolution. Aunt Petunia had been watching Harry with a new quality in her sharp, pale eyes, not the usual pinched contempt but something more complex. Something that had been there occasionally since third year but was stronger now, something Harry had never been able to fully categorize. She watched him go into the garden and said nothing, which was in itself a kind of statement. The garden, the tarpaulin, the ruined lawn, the surviving flower beds was empty of Dursleys. Harry stood in the space between the covered crater and the back fence and looked at the fence, an old wooden one, 2 panels missing, the kind of fence that had clearly been a project someone had started and not finished, and swung the axe. The sound it made was extraordinary. Not loud exactly but resonant, a clean, bell-like tone as it cut through the air, and then a second quality underneath it that Harry could only describe as pressure. The way the air moved away from the blade was different from the way air moves away from any other object. It moved with intention. It moved like weather. He swung it again, and this time he was ready for it, and he leaned into the movement and felt the balance of it, the extraordinary, precise balance of something made by hands better than human hands for purposes that were entirely, uncomplicatedly clear. It was a weapon, it knew what it was, it didn't apologize for it. Harry had held wands, which were weapons too in their way, but wands were conduits, they channeled, they didn't commit, this committed. This was honest in a way that Harry, who had spent 14 years learning to read the gap between what adults said and what they meant, found deeply, unexpectedly refreshing. On the sixth swing he tried something without quite intending to. He released mid-arc and let the axe go. It was either an experiment or a reflex, and he wasn't sure which. The axe crossed the garden in a flat spinning arc, buried itself in the fence post at the far end with a crack that startled 2 pigeons off a roof 3 houses away, and then, before Harry had fully processed what had happened, pulled free and flew back to his hand, clean and unhesitating, like something on a very long elastic. He stood there with his arm still extended, hand closed around the returned handle, and listened to the pigeons complaining in the distance. Right, he said. He went inside and wrote 2 letters. To Ron, something happened this summer, I'm fine, tell you when I see you. Hope the tickets are what I think they are. To Hermione, I need to show you something. It's not bad, I don't think it's bad. Actually, I think it's the least bad thing that's ever fallen into my life, which is saying something, see you soon. He sealed them, attached them to Hedwig, and sent her off into the evening sky, and stood at his window watching her go until she was a white speck and then nothing. And then he turned back to his room and sat on the floor with the axe in his lap, and let the quiet of the summer evening settle around him. His birthday arrived the way birthdays at the Dursleys always arrived, with silence on the ground floor, which was as close to acknowledgement as he was going to get from that direction. What arrived from other directions, however, was considerably more. Hermione's parcel, carefully wrapped, the paper charmed not to crinkle during post, contained a card that she'd clearly spent time on, the message inside full of the specific warm precision of Hermione's affection, which expressed itself through careful word choice rather than effusion. The book tucked inside was called Runes of the Elder World, a comparative study, and it was heavy and old-smelling, and several of the pages had been paper-clipped with what he was fairly sure were color-coded tabs, because Hermione had pre-researched his birthday present in case it required context. He sat with that for a moment, the warmth of it. Ron's contribution was a thick wedge of cake wrapped in enchanted cling film that had kept it fresh and structurally sound through whatever journey it had made, and the note tucked in the cling film said simply, "Mum made it. It's chocolate. Happy birthday, mate." 3 words, all of them the right ones. Mrs. Weasley's own parcel arrived 40 minutes later and contained enough food for a week, packed with the same aggressive love that characterized everything Molly Weasley did for the people she decided were hers. Harry unpacked it slowly and ate a piece of bread with real butter and closed his eyes and felt for a moment what it was like to be taken care of. With the Weasley parcel folded into an envelope tucked between 2 shortbread biscuits were 4 tickets. Harry read the front of them twice. Then he sat on his bed and read them a third time because they were the kind of thing that required confirmation. Quidditch World Cup Final, Ireland versus Bulgaria. Arthur Weasley's handwriting on the accompanying note was only barely containing itself. Harry, to spare. Come stay at the burrow first, pick you up Saturday, tell your uncle we won't take no for an answer, and I mean that in the politest possible way. Harry laughed. Actually laughed out loud in his room on his birthday, alone except for an Asgardian axe that pulsed warmly in the corner at the sound. He was going to the Quidditch World Cup. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Arthur Weasley arrived with Fred and George in a car that had no business passing any known roadworthiness test and did not appear to be subject to earthly physics. And the conversation he had with Vernon on the front step lasted approximately 6 minutes, and was one of the finest things Harry had ever witnessed. Arthur asking questions about Muggle items in the specific tone of someone who finds them endlessly fascinating. Vernon responding in the specific tone of someone who is being asked to interact with a lunatic, and has decided the fastest path to resolution is compliance, both of them leaving satisfied in entirely different ways. Fred and George materialized in Harry's room, took one look at the axe and went very quiet, which for Fred and George Weasley was practically unprecedented. Is that? Fred started. Yes, Harry said. Where did it fell out of the sky? Brilliant, George said. He had the tone of a man who had just recalibrated his entire working definition of brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Can I? Fred started, reaching for it. Harry picked it up off the wall before Fred could get there, and Fred's hand stopped mid-reach, and for a moment they both just looked at the axe in Harry's hand. I wouldn't, Harry said, not threatening, not unkind, just honest. Fred pulled his hand back. He had the expression of someone who has touched something very hot without burning, who has registered the heat through some sense other than pain. He and George exchanged the specific twin look that communicated entire conversations, and then George picked up Harry's school trunk and Fred picked up Hedwig's empty cage, and neither of them mentioned it again. Which Harry would later reflect was one of the more impressive acts of self-restraint he had ever witnessed from either of them. The campsite for the World Cup was a small city. That was the only way to describe it. A sprawling, enormous, impossibly varied city that had appeared in a field in the English countryside and would disappear again in 4 days. Populated by wizards from 40 countries in a state of shared excitement that transcended language barriers and turned strangers into neighbors. Harry walked through it with his head on something approaching a swivel, taking in the flags, the food, the noise, the extraordinary variety of magical modifications people had made to otherwise standard camping equipment, and felt alive. The specific alive of somewhere you belong. He'd left Stormbreaker in the tent. He'd thought about it and decided that the campsite was not the place for it, not because he was hiding it, but because the campsite was for being 14 at the World Cup, which had its own kind of importance. The match was Ireland against Bulgaria, and it was everything. Harry had seen Quidditch, had played Quidditch, had loved Quidditch with the whole of his heart since the first time he'd been on a broom, but he had never seen it at this level, the level where every player was operating at the absolute edge of human capability, where the chasers moved like something choreographed by physics itself, and the beaters had clearly spent years learning to be extensions of their bats. Crumb, when he appeared in the Bulgarian team's entrance, had the particular quality of a very dangerous thing in its natural element. Harry watched him with the close attention of someone assessing a threat and then decided, watching the first Wronski feint, that Crumb was simply extraordinary and deserved to be watched on those terms. He was on his feet in the 114,000-person stadium, surrounded by the roar of it, and he thought, this is what it's for. All the learning and the surviving. It's also for this, Ireland won. They celebrated in the way that people who haven't slept in a day and are drunk on excitement and butter beer, and the residual electricity of great sport celebrate, enthusiastically, comprehensively, and in Fred and George's case with fireworks that were almost certainly not commercially available. Harry went to his sleeping bag with the noise of the campsite still ringing in his ears, his hand resting on the floor near the handle of Stormbreaker, and slept with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has had, for a day, exactly enough. He woke to screaming, not the screaming of celebration, you know the difference. Even through 2 layers of sleep and the tent canvas and the general noise of a campsite at 2 in the morning, you know, the quality of fear screaming is its own frequency. Harry was up. Jeans, trainers, out of the tent flap before he had fully consciously decided to move, and his right hand had the axe before his brain had quite caught up with his body. That was new. Or rather, it was something he'd done when training in the garden, and his reflexes had apparently filed it under important and retrieved it now. His wand was in his left hand. The campsite was burning in 3 places. Not wildly targeted fires, the kind that spoke of intention, and above the paths between tents, visible in the firelight and the wand light of 100 panicking people, dark-robed figures moved. Some were casting, the whoosh of magic doing violent things to canvas. The specific horrible crack of apparition used offensively. And above it all, 30 feet up, held by some invisible magical force, a family was spinning slowly through the air. The man, the woman, 2 children, muggles. Harry could tell at this distance from the pajamas, from the confusion on their faces that was a different category of confusion from the terror around them, the confusion of people who genuinely do not have any framework for what is happening. The woman was screaming. The smaller of the 2 children had stopped making noise, which was worse than the screaming. Harry looked at the figures on the ground. He looked at the family in the air. He looked at the distance, 30 feet, roughly 40 at a stretch, and the angle was clear. He threw the axe. He'd done it twice in the garden against a fence post. He had no idea precisely what he was doing. He had an idea, imprecise and instinctive, and his arm went back and the release was clean and the axe left his hand and crossed the air between him and the spinning family in a flat spinning arc that was faster than his eyes could properly track. It hit the levitation charm like a sound, like a bell being struck very cleanly, a resonant tone that he felt in his chest, and the invisible force holding the family vanished. They fell. 6 feet, maybe 7, he'd been hoping for less, and the woman landed well enough to grab the child on instinct, mother reflex operating below conscious thought, and the man hit the ground and rolled and nobody was hurt. Not badly. Not badly at all, considering. Stormbreaker came back to his hand with that instant, unhesitating return he'd practiced in the garden, and Harry closed his fingers around the handle and turned to face the campsite. The Death Eaters, that was what they were. He'd recognized the masks before he'd fully registered anything else. Some part of his brain having apparently added Death Eater masks to the same reflexive catalog as creaking floorboards had stopped. All 5 of them, or 6, it was hard to tell in the chaos. They'd stopped in the specific way that people stop when something has happened that they hadn't prepared for. Harry walked forward 3 paces. He wasn't running. He wasn't drawing himself up, wasn't posturing. He was just walking toward them the way you walk toward something that needs to be dealt with, and behind him he could hear Ron tumbling out of the tent and Hermione's sharp intake of breath and the general continuing screaming of the campsite, and in front of him the masked figures were reassessing in real time. "Put them down," Harry said, meaning the other people still being held, still being spun, visible above 2 tents to his left. His voice came out level and clear and not particularly loud, but it carried the way the axe's tone had carried, through the noise rather than over it. All of them, now. 2 of the figures ran without further discussion, which said something about the quality of Death Eater recruitment in the post-Voldemort era. A third raised a wand. Harry's Expelliarmus was out of his left hand before the thought had fully formed, the spell so practiced it was essentially reflex, and the wand flew from the figure's grip and Harry caught it out of the air and looked at the remaining 3. They looked at him, at the axe, at him. The calculus was visible even through the masks. They ran. Harry didn't follow. He turned, looked for the remaining levitated people, found them. They'd been dropped the moment the last figure bolted, and thankfully from a lower altitude than the family, and started moving through the campsite toward where people needed help. He called out twice, clear, carrying for anyone with medical training, and 2 witches appeared from a tent to the left who turned out to be healers from St. Mungo's, and he directed them to the family and moved on. Ron caught up with him at the edge of the 3rd fire. His face was doing a great many things simultaneously. "Harry, what did you just tell you later?" Harry said. "Help me with this." They worked. The 3 of them, Harry and Ron and Hermione, plus Percy who appeared from the direction of the ministry officials' tents looking simultaneously horrified and relieved, moving through the campsite with the practiced emergency competence of people who had survived enough crises together to have developed a system. Hermione organized. Ron followed up. Harry went first. He put out the large fire with rain. He hadn't planned to. He'd looked at it and thought very clearly that needs to stop, and looked at the sky, and something in him had reached, not with his wand, not with the axe, but with some quality that the axe amplified or channeled or simply gave him access to, and the clouds had responded. A short, decisive downpour, precise as a bucket, that hit the fire and left it smoking and harmless. It lasted 90 seconds. When it stopped, Harry was standing in the drizzle looking at the extinguished fire and feeling, not triumphant, but satisfied, in the specific way you feel when a thing has been done correctly. Hermione appeared at his elbow and looked at the wet ground and the smoking remains of the fire and then at Harry and then at the sky. She didn't say anything immediately. She didn't, Harry thought, have the words yet. Hermione, who always had the words, was taking a moment to locate them. She sat down on an overturned cooler box that had survived the chaos relatively intact. After a second, Harry sat beside her. The campsite was quieting, the screaming had stopped, people were emerging from their hiding places. Ministry officials were moving through in pairs with the brisk, purposeful energy of people who are doing damage control, and are not going to acknowledge how bad the damage was. Hermione looked at the axe in Harry's hand. She looked for a long time. The glow of its markings was low and quiet now, the cycling color steady and slow, the hum barely perceptible. How long, she said. About 2 weeks. She closed her eyes, opened them. You should have told us immediately. I know I didn't know how. Harry, Hermione, he said it gently. I know. She took a breath, squared her shoulders. And he could see it happening, the shift from feeling to function, from the Hermione who wanted to express several things at high volume to the Hermione who had a problem in front of her and a mind built for problems. Right, she said. All right, she looked at the axe again, and this time her expression was pure, unguarded interest. It's Asgardian, he looked at her. You know what it is. I know what it might be. There are texts. She stopped, recalibrated, picked up speed. Pre-Roman magical theory. Most scholars treat it as mythology or metaphor, the references to the 9 realms and the beings that inhabited them, but the specific references to weaponry, weapons forged in the heart of dying stars, those are too detailed to be purely allegorical. She was looking at the markings. Those aren't runic script. I mean, they derive from runes, Elder Futhark maybe, but they've evolved beyond or before. She stopped again. I'm going to need my books. Okay. They're in my bag, most of them. I also want to send an owl to the British Museum's magical archives. I know a researcher there, Hermione. What? You can start tomorrow. She looked at him. Her expression shifted into something softer and more honest. Are you all right? He thought about the question. About the 2 weeks in his bedroom, the garden, the rain he'd called from a clear sky 11 minutes ago. About the feel of the axe in his hand, and the click of something settling and the quiet glow of something that had been looking for him for a long time and found him in the ruins of a Surrey garden. Yeah, he said. And then, because it was Hermione, better than all right actually, which is the part I don't know what to do with. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded slowly in the way that meant she was filing things carefully and would return to them. We'll figure it out, she said, all of it. I know we will. Ron found them 10 minutes later, slightly out of breath and with a tear in his sleeve and wearing an expression of someone who has been trying to organize his thoughts about something for the last 15 minutes and hasn't succeeded. He sat on the ground in front of the cooler and looked at Harry, and then at the axe, and then at Harry. So, he said. So, Harry agreed. Ron opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. The rain, was that you? Yes. And the with the family, yes. Right, Ron said. He pulled at the grass beside him, not looking at either of them. Right, okay. He pulled at the grass some more. Is it, does it? He stopped, took a breath. Why you? He said, and it came out rower than he'd meant it to, Harry could tell, and Ron heard it too and looked up briefly and then away. I don't know, Harry said honestly. I've been asking it that. Ron pulled at the grass. The silence between them was the complicated kind, but it wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that means something is real enough to require actual processing, not just reaction. Then Ron said quieter, what's it feel like? Harry thought about it. Like something that should have happened a long time ago, he said. Ron looked at him. Something moved in his face, not resolved, not finished, but real, and that was enough for now. He nodded. Okay, he said, and it meant more than just okay. It meant I'm still here. It meant give me a minute, I'll catch up. It was enough. They boarded the Hogwarts Express 5 days later, and Harry sat in the compartment with Ron and Hermione and Stormbreaker propped against the seat beside him like a third presence in the room. Patient, humming, glowing faintly in that impossible color that turned the ordinary train window into something extraordinary. The conversation covered the tournament, which was now confirmed. Even the Ministry Owls had stopped pretending it was a secret. And the strange atmosphere in the magical community since the campsite attack, and Percy's upcoming ministry career, and whether the Chudley Cannons had any realistic path to a title that didn't involve the other teams suffering a collective amnesia, which was Ron's preferred theory. Ginny appeared in the compartment door, looked at the axe with the frank, assessing look of someone who has grown up with dragons in the backyard and has calibrated her response to remarkable things accordingly, and said, "That's new," and left. Neville put his head in, spotted the axe, went slightly pale, said, "Sorry, wrong compartment," despite this being exactly the right compartment, and retreated. Fred and George stopped by, looked at the axe, looked at Harry, did the twin communication thing, said in unison, "Don't suppose we could borrow it for a product test," received a look from Harry that communicated a clear answer, and departed entirely satisfied with the exchange. Hermione had her notebook out. She'd been up late the last 2 nights at the campsite working through runes of the Elder World and a stack of other texts she'd produced from her bag with the efficiency of someone who has been planning this research since the moment the subject arrived. She'd highlighted things in 3 colors which Harry had learned meant, "I understand this needs more work, and this should not be possible, but apparently is." There was a lot of yellow. "The worthiness criteria," she said at one point, not looking up from the notebook. "The texts describe it differently each time, but the common thread is it's not about power. It's not about magical ability, it's not about bloodline. It's something to do with," she tapped the page with her pen, character, and not in a vague way, in a very specific way. Which is, Ron said. She looked up, looked at Harry. Willingness to bear the weight, she said. Every reference uses that phrase or some version of it. The weapon goes to whoever is willing to bear not just its power but its responsibility, its purpose. She looked at the axe. And Harry, I've been thinking about your life. She stopped. That came out differently than I meant. No, Harry said, go on. She took a breath. You have never once chosen power for its own sake. Every time something powerful has happened, the Patronus, the Parseltongue, the way you fly, it's always in service of something else, someone else. She paused. The axe didn't choose someone who could wield it most effectively. It chose someone who would only use it when it needed using. The compartment was quiet for a moment. Ron was looking at Hermione with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering a few things. Then he said, when you put it like that, I usually have a point, Hermione said mildly. You always have a point, Harry said. Sometimes several at once, it's overwhelming. She gave him a look that was trying to be stern and wasn't quite managing. We should also discuss what you're going to do when we arrive at Hogwarts and everyone sees it. I'll deal with that then, Harry said. It might be easier to have a plan, Hermione. He looked at her steadily. I have the axe, I'll figure out the rest. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded slowly and returned to her notebook, and the pen resumed its scratching, and outside the window England rolled past in the last gold of late summer, the green going towards autumn at the edges, and the train moved north through the cooling afternoon toward the mountains and the castle and the year that was coming. Stormbreaker sat beside Harry and hummed its quiet, patient hum. The light from the windows caught the markings on the blade and scattered that impossible color across the ceiling of the compartment. Not quite silver, not quite blue, not quite moonlight, not quite any word Harry had, and he watched it move across the ceiling for a while and felt the year ahead of him like weather you can smell before it arrives. Turbulent, significant, and entirely unavoidable. He wasn't afraid of it. That was new. Not the absence of fear exactly, he'd face moments ahead that would test that, he knew, but the quiet knowledge that whatever came, he was arriving at it as himself. No more, no less. Stormbreaker had not made him someone else. It had looked at him, at the real him, at 14 years of survival and stubbornness and loyalty, and the quiet, unshowy courage of someone who keeps getting up, and it had made a decision. And the decision was, yes, finally. Chapter 2, The Boy Who Lifted It. The Great Hall smelled like it always did on the first night. Candles and roast chicken and old stone, and the specific electric excitement of several hundred students who have been apart for 3 months and have a great deal to say to each other. The enchanted ceiling was doing its autumn thing, cloud-heavy and deep. A few stars visible through gaps where the cloud thinned. The candles floated at their usual heights. The tables were the usual long rivers of noise and color. Everything was the same, except Harry walked in with Stormbreaker. He hadn't hidden it. He'd thought about it on the train, thought about leaving it in his trunk, thought about the cloak, thought about half a dozen versions of Not Yet, and then decided against all of them. Not out of bravado, out of something more practical. Whatever this year was going to be, whatever the tournament meant, and whatever Hermione's research was pointing toward, Harry had learned enough from 3 years at this school to know that the moment you started hiding something important was the moment it became a secret. And secrets at Hogwarts had a way of becoming weapons in the hands of people who didn't deserve them. So he walked in. He'd worn it over his shoulder, the handle rising above his right shoulder, the blade at his left hip, which was slightly awkward given the physics of moving through a crowded doorway, and he'd had to angle himself getting through the entrance, which somewhat undermined the drama of the entrance. Ron, walking beside him, had whispered, "Turn sideways," which Harry had done, and then they were in, and the noise of the Great Hall hit them the way the noise of the Great Hall always did, like weather. The noise changed, not stopped. The Great Hall never fully stopped, but it shifted the way a large crowd shifts when something enters its peripheral vision that it doesn't know what to do with yet. Heads turning, conversations flagging. The ripple of attention moving table to table from the door inward. Harry walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down. The silence, such as it was, lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Dean Thomas, who was sitting 2 spots along and had been staring since Harry came through the door, said, "Is that an axe?" "Yes," Harry said. "Where did you get an axe?" "It fell out of the sky." Dean processed this. Beside him, Seamus Finnegan, who had a comprehensive history of responses to remarkable things that spanned brilliant and how do I get one, said, "Can it do magic?" "I think so," Harry said. "I'm still working out the specifics." "Can I?" "No," Harry said pleasantly. Hermione sat down across from him and opened a book before she'd fully settled into her seat, which was so essentially Hermione that it grounded the moment somehow. If Hermione was opening books, the situation was normal enough to proceed. Ron sat beside Harry and loaded his plate with the focused efficiency of someone who has spent the train journey next to food and has been patient about it long enough. The staring continued through the first course. Harry noticed it the way you notice weather, not ignoring it exactly, just not letting it redirect him. The Hufflepuffs to their right were pointing. The Ravenclaws were having what looked like a fairly intense discussion, several of them looking over at intervals. The Slytherin table was doing something more interesting, not pointing, not whispering, but watching with a studied casualness that was its own kind of tell. Draco Malfoy was watching him, not with the usual arrangement of contempt and performance. He was watching with a quality that Harry, after 3 years of reading Malfoy like a particularly obnoxious text, could only describe as calculation. Draco's eyes went to the axe, returned to Harry's face, went back to the axe. He said something to Crabbe on his left without looking at him, and Crabbe looked and Draco said something else and Crabbe stopped looking. Whatever conclusion Draco was drawing, he was drawing it privately. The sorting happened. The first years came in their terrified, damp-haired procession and the hat did its song and the names were called and Harry watched the new Gryffindors appear at the table and felt the strange lurch of recognition. They looked so small. He'd been that small 3 years ago. He hadn't known it at the time, then Dumbledore stood. The thing about Dumbledore's announcements was that he had a particular rhythm to them. The wandering opening, the deflection into something that seemed unrelated, and then the pivot to the actual point, which arrived with the timing of someone who had been placing chess pieces for the last 10 minutes and was now making the move that mattered. Harry had learned this rhythm over 3 years and could identify the pivot coming now before it arrived. The wandering opening, food, term beginning, reminders about the Forbidden Forest. The deflection, this year there would be no Quidditch. The howl of anguish from the student body at this was bipartisan in a way that house rivalries rarely permitted. Gryffindors and Slytherins united in shared outrage. Ron went the color of his hair. Hermione, who had known this was coming from her research, very carefully did not look smug about having known. And then the pivot, the Triwizard Tournament. Dumbledore explained it with the measured pace of someone who knew the information he was delivering was significant enough to carry itself without embellishment. Harry watched the student body absorb it, the history, the 3 tasks, the eternal glory, and the prize of 1,000 galleons, at which point even Hermione looked up from her book. 1 champion from each of 3 schools, an age restriction of 17, the Goblet of Fire as the selection mechanism. Dumbledore had glanced at Harry twice during the announcement. Just twice, quickly, and without the usual quality of the Dumbledore looks at Harry interaction, without the specific warm assessment that Harry had always found complicated, that mixture of pride and guilt and calculation that sat behind the half-moon glasses. These glances were different, more uncertain. Harry noted them and filed them. After dinner, moving back toward Gryffindor Tower through corridors that were already buzzing with tournament discussion, Harry was intercepted. Not ambushed, intercepted, which has a different quality, being a thing that someone has clearly thought about and positioned for. It was Professor McGonagall, who appeared from the direction of the marble staircase with the precision of someone who has timed their arrival perfectly and is not going to pretend otherwise. Potter, as she said a word. Her office had the particular atmosphere of a room that is tidy in the way that reveals rather than conceals the person who occupies it. The tartans, the desk with its carefully organized stacks of parchment, the biscuit tin that she had never once opened in front of a student, and that Harry was fairly certain was not actually full of biscuits. She sat behind the desk. Harry sat across from it with Stormbreaker across his knees, which he was aware was a slightly unusual posture for a meeting with his head of house, but which was also simply where it was comfortable. McGonagall looked at the axe for a long moment. Her expression was doing less than he expected. She had better control of her face than almost anyone he knew, and she was using it now. "You brought that into the school," she said. "Yes, Professor, without consulting anyone." "I thought about consulting," Harry said. "I decided it was mine to carry." She looked at him over the rim of her glasses. Indeed, she looked at the axe again. Her fingers, he noticed, had moved to the edge of her desk and then back. She wanted to touch it. She was not going to touch it. That said more about Minerva McGonagall than almost anything else could. "Do you know what it is?" "I know what Hermione thinks it is." "And what does Miss Granger think?" "Asgardian," Harry said. "Forged in a dying star, it chooses who carries it." McGonagall's expression did something very small and very telling, the almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes of someone who has just confirmed something they had theorized but not verified. She knew, she'd known before he'd walked in, Harry realized, or suspected. Dumbledore had probably been in this office earlier this evening. "The headmaster," she said carefully, "would like to examine it." "I'm sure he would," Harry said. A pause. "Potter, I'm not refusing," Harry said. "I'll talk to Professor Dumbledore, but not tonight." He looked at her steadily. "It's mine, Professor. I'm not saying that to be difficult. It's mine the way my wand is mine. Would you ask me to hand my wand over for examination?" McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face, respect, or something adjacent to it, or the specific emotional response of a woman who has spent 30 years watching this school chew up children and is experiencing a complicated feeling about a child who has turned up armed against it. "The headmaster will want to speak with you," she said finally. "Tomorrow morning before breakfast." "I'll be there," Harry said. He stood, settling the axe. "Professor, can I ask you something?" "You may." "The tournament, the age line. Could someone get around it, the enchantment?" Her eyes sharpened. "A powerful enough wizard with sufficient knowledge of exception charms, theoretically, yes." "Why, just thinking," Harry said. McGonagall looked at him with an expression that said she knew perfectly well he wasn't just thinking and that she was choosing for reasons of her own not to push it tonight. "Good night, Potter." "Good night, Professor." He went back to Gryffindor Tower and lay on his bed and stared at the canopy and thought about the way Dumbledore had glanced at him during the announcement. The calculation in it. The unfamiliarity of that calculation. It was the look of a chess player who has just noticed a new piece on the board and is rapidly revising his assessment of the game. Harry thought, good, let him revise it. He fell asleep with the axe beside the bed, and in his sleep in the way of dreams he saw a dying star, saw it from outside, the impossible scale of it, the fire and the mass of it, and in the dream he wasn't afraid of it. In the dream it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Dumbledore's office in the morning had the quality it always had: accumulated time, the feeling of being inside something that had existed long enough to have a character the way old houses have characters. The portraits of previous headmasters dozed in their frames. The instruments made their small, ticking measurements of things Harry had never been able to fully identify. Fawkes on his perch made a soft sound at Harry's entrance that was warm. There was no other word. The Phoenix looked at Stormbreaker and made the soft sound again. Dumbledore was behind the desk. He looked as he almost always looked, as though he had been calmly waiting for the precise person who had just walked in and was unsurprised by both their arrival and their timing. It was an extremely effective impression. Harry, who had spent 3 years having it done at him, was beginning to distinguish the moments when it was genuine from the moments when it was performed. This was a performed morning. Dumbledore was carefully arranged behind his desk, and the carefully arranged quality of him was itself information. "Harry," he said, "please sit." Harry sat. The axe went against the arm of the chair, handle upright. Dumbledore looked at it. For once the twinkle in his eyes was entirely absent, not replaced by anything cold or hostile, just genuinely, quietly absent. He was looking at Stormbreaker the way a man looks at something that has fundamentally altered the parameters of a situation he thought he understood. "You found it this summer," Dumbledore said. "It found me," Harry said, "but yes, this summer. The crater in your uncle's garden." A slight smile. The Ministry's improper use of magic office received 7 reports from the surrounding area. None of them, interestingly, described magic. They described a meteorological event. "I suggested that explanation to my uncle." "Quite." Dumbledore looked at him. "May I ask how it feels to carry it?" Harry thought about the question. He appreciated that Dumbledore had asked about feeling rather than function. It was, he thought, either genuine human curiosity or a very clever approach to the information he actually wanted, and possibly both. With Dumbledore it was usually both. "Like something that was always going to happen," Harry said. "Like a door opening." Dumbledore nodded very slowly. His fingers were interlaced on the desk, and he was looking at them rather than at Harry, which was unusual. Dumbledore typically used eye contact as a tool with some precision. "Harry, I want to be honest with you." "I'd appreciate that, sir." The honesty of that "I'd appreciate" that was not lost on Dumbledore, Harry could tell. Something shifted slightly in his posture. "What you're carrying is beyond anything I have direct knowledge of. That is a rare admission for me to make. I have studied magic for over a century, and there are very few things I can say with certainty I do not understand." He looked at the axe. "That is one of them. It is not purely magical, not in the way we define magic. It operates on principles older than our systems." He looked back at Harry. "And it chose you." "Yes. Do you know why? Hermione has a theory." Harry watched him. "Do you have one?" Dumbledore's eyes went to the middle distance. "I think," he said, with the care of a man selecting words from a large and complex inventory, "that the weapon you carry has a philosophy, and that philosophy does not distinguish between the magic in a person and the quality in a person. The two are separate criteria." He paused. "The magic in you is considerable, Harry, and always has been, but I suspect that is not what was assessed." Harry looked at him steadily. "What was?" "I believe," Dumbledore said quietly, "it assessed what you have done with what has been done to you." The office was very quiet. One of the portrait headmasters, who had appeared to be asleep, shifted slightly in his frame. Harry thought about that. About the exact meaning of it and the implications underneath the meaning, and the strange particular weight of being summed up accurately by someone who had also in the same motion been honest about the fact that things had been done to him, framed that way passive as if acknowledging that a child had not simply found himself in circumstances by accident. "I should get to breakfast," Harry said. "Of course." Dumbledore didn't push. "Harry, I would ask that you be careful, not with the axe itself. With the way this year will respond to it, people will want things from you." "They always do," Harry said. He left. In the corridor outside the gargoyle, he stopped and breathed and let the conversation settle. Then he went down to breakfast. It took approximately 48 hours for the story to achieve its final form, which was, as these things went at Hogwarts, a compound of rumor and exaggeration built on an accurate foundation, the way pearls are built, one irritant at a time. By Wednesday, the version circulating the corridors was that Harry Potter had wrestled the weapon from a Norse god, and it was so powerful it had destroyed half of Surrey. By Thursday, there were two competing accounts, one in which Harry had called lightning from the sky at the World Cup campsite and driven off 100 Death Eaters single-handedly, and one, authored primarily by the Slytherin table, in which the axe was stolen property and Harry was lying about the circumstances of acquisition. Harry heard both versions and did nothing to correct either of them, which was itself a form of correction. The Daily Prophet ran a piece on Thursday morning, buried in Section 2 behind an article about the upcoming tournament delegation arrivals. Boy who lived returns to Hogwarts with unknown weapon, ministry to investigate. The reporter had clearly spoken to nobody from the school and had constructed the article from inference, and whatever source at the ministry had tipped them off. Probably someone in the improper use of magic office who had read the report about the Surrey crater and drawn their own conclusions. The piece quoted an unnamed ministry official describing the situation as under review, which Harry had learned meant we're deciding how alarmed to be. "You should respond to this," Hermione said, looking up from the prophet over breakfast. "With what? A statement, context, something. Or I could just keep carrying it," Harry said, "and let people figure it out." Hermione gave him the look. "Not everything figures itself out, Harry." "This will," Ron said through toast. Both Harry and Hermione looked at him. He swallowed. "I mean, look, the prophet wrote mystery weapon because they don't know what it is. Once they see it in action, they'll know." He thought about it. "Probably they'll be even more dramatic about it, actually, but at least it'll be accurate dramatic." "That's surprisingly pragmatic," Hermione said. "I have my moments," Ron said. Harry ate his eggs and read the rest of the prophet and didn't think about the article any further. He'd learned early that the prophet's relationship with the truth was aspirational, and he'd stopped letting it direct his emotional energy around second year, when it had described his Quidditch injury in a way that bore no resemblance to the injury he had actually sustained. What he did think about was the Goblet of Fire, which was being installed that afternoon in the entrance hall. He was thinking about it in the specific, focused way he'd been thinking about it since the train, turning it over, examining it from angles, because something about the tournament had the quality of a thing that required examination before arrival. He had a feeling. He'd had feelings like this before, and his record with them was good enough that he'd stopped dismissing them as paranoia. Something about the tournament was being managed in a way that was meant to look unmanaged. Dumbledore's careful arrangement in the office. The way McGonagall had looked at him when he'd asked about the age line. The specific, slightly too complete explanation of the goblet at dinner. He thought about who would benefit from a Hogwarts champion who was not who they appeared to be. He thought about what he knew of Voldemort's resources and his capacity for patience. He thought about the year ahead, and the tournament, and the new defense against the dark arts teacher, Moody Mad-Eye Moody, the legendary Auror, who had arrived that morning and taught the afternoon class in a way that Harry had found both extraordinary and, in some quality he couldn't articulate, slightly off. He sat with the feeling and paid attention to it. The axe, propped against the bench beside him, hummed once, just once, in the low frequency that meant yes, pay attention. He did. The Goblet of Fire was installed in the entrance hall with a cordon of golden rope at a 10-foot distance, the age line drawn around it in a thin, shimmering circle by Dumbledore himself. It was beautiful in the way dangerous things are often beautiful. The blue-white flame entirely without heat, the ancient carved wood of the cup, the sensation of standing near it that was like standing near a very old decision. Harry stood at the cordon for a moment on Thursday evening and looked at it. He could feel it from here. Not the same as Stormbreaker, different entirely, a different frequency, a different quality, but old the same way Stormbreaker was old. There was nothing friendly about the goblet. It wasn't hostile exactly. It was simply very, very serious in the way of things that have been imbued with purpose over centuries and have forgotten how to be casual. "You're not putting your name in," Hermione said from his left. "No," Harry said. "Good," she paused. "Not because you couldn't, I know, but because something doesn't feel right about it. He looked at her. You feel it too, she hesitated. Hermione didn't deal comfortably with information she couldn't source, but she'd also been with Harry long enough to have calibrated his instincts against her research and found a consistent alignment. Something feels engineered, she said quietly. The timing of the tournament, the particular selection mechanism, the rules around age, she paused. They're not security measures, they're a filter. I've been thinking the same thing, Harry said. Dumbledore's worried, she said. He hit it well, but his announcement at the feast, there were moments, small ones. I don't think this tournament is what it's being presented as. Probably not, Harry said. They stood there for a moment looking at the goblet. A group of sixth years approached the cordon with the bravado of students who have decided the age line is a challenge rather than a warning, and Harry and Hermione moved aside. The students produced what were clearly aged potion vials, purchased from somewhere, probably Zonko's, probably inaccurate, and stepped across the line. The goblet didn't react. The age line reacted. Both sixth years were launched backward in long, elegant arcs, and landed in a heap 5 feet from the cordon with their hair rapidly transforming into long white beards that grew at an alarming rate. The hall erupted in laughter. Fred and George, who had been watching from the staircase with the specific anticipatory stillness of people who had already tried this themselves and knew what was coming, looked simultaneously vindicated and sympathetic. Harry didn't laugh. Not unkindly, it was funny, but he was watching the goblet, which had done nothing, which had simply continued burning its cold blue-white flame and being very serious and very ancient and entirely unmoved by the chaos around it. It knows, he said. What? The age line doesn't fool it, Harry said. It's not the line doing the judgment. The line is just the physical expression of the criterion. The goblet is the thing that's actually deciding. He looked at it. So the question is whether the decision can be influenced from outside the goblet itself. Hermione was quiet. He could hear her thinking, the quality of her silence when something has clicked into place, and she's following the implications to their conclusion. Someone could input a name with an enchantment designed to misrepresent the submitter, she said, not fool the goblet itself but give it altered information. Or, Harry said, someone inside the school is doing it on someone else's behalf. The implications settled between them. We should tell Dumbledore, Hermione said. We have suspicions and no evidence, Harry said. Dumbledore has suspicions and no evidence. We'd be combining things we don't know to tell each other things we already suspect. He looked at her. We keep our eyes open, we see what Halloween produces. She didn't like it, he could tell from the set of her shoulders, but she nodded. Hermione could tell the difference between recklessness and strategy, even when strategy looked uncomfortably like waiting. Halloween arrived the way it always arrived at Hogwarts, with the Great Hall decorated in the particular aesthetic that Hagrid managed every year, and that was always somehow both wonderful and slightly horrifying. Pumpkins the size of small cars, candles in skull arrangements, the bats from the dungeons doing their swooping circuits of the enchanted ceiling. The feast was good. The mood was festive. The foreign students, the girls from Beaubaix in their periwinkle robes, the Durmstrang boys in their fur-trimmed dark red, had been at the school for 2 days and were still regarding Hogwarts with the particular mix of admiration and bewilderment that a school which moves its staircases tends to provoke. Harry ate and talked and let the evening be festive, and watched Durmstrang's Karkaroff with the corner of his eye. Igor Karkaroff, Durmstrang's headmaster, had the affect of a man who had spent a long time performing loyalty to something he feared and wasn't entirely sure the performance was still necessary. His eyes moved too much. He sat too straight. He watched Dumbledore the way someone watches a door they might need to run for. And Crumb sat at the end of the Durmstrang table, and students from every house kept finding reasons to walk past him, and he looked at his plate with the expression of someone who had long since stopped seeing the attention and now simply navigated it as a feature of his environment, the way you navigate furniture in a room you've lived in long enough. Harry understood that expression. He had a version of it himself. The meal ended, Dumbledore rose. The goblet of fire was brought into the hall. Its flame had shifted from blue-white to deep red in the last 24 hours, which had prompted a number of competing theories in the corridors, and the hall went quiet in the specific way of a large group of people who have individually decided to be quiet simultaneously. The names came out in reverse order of importance, because Dumbledore was a man who understood theatrical structure. Fleur de Lacquer for Beaubaix, which produced a wave of admiring noise from several boys in the hall and a collective of course from the Beaubaix table. Victor Crumb for Durmstrang, which produced a different kind of noise, not surprised, but confirming, like a crowd watching something inevitable arrive. Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts, which produced the largest noise of the three, Hufflepuffs especially, who erupted in a way that Harry found genuinely heartwarming because Hufflepuffs so rarely got to erupt about anything. The hall settled. The feast was returning to itself. Congratulations being offered, the excitement beginning its natural decline into post-meal sociability, and Harry reached for his pumpkin juice and the goblet flared. One more name. The parchment drifted down through the air the way they all had, unhurried, burning at its edges, the name appearing in the goblet's fire as it descended. Dumbledore caught it, read it. And the expression on his face, Harry was watching him specifically, had been watching him, was not the shock of a man surprised by an event. It was the tight, controlled expression of a man confirming the thing he had been afraid of. Harry Potter, Dumbledore said. The silence was extraordinary. The kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound so much as the suppression of it, every person in the hall holding what they were about to say and waiting. Harry did not move. He sat at the Gryffindor table with his pumpkin juice in his hand and looked at Dumbledore, and then looked around the hall with the calm of someone who has been ambushed before and has calibrated their response to it accordingly. He felt the eyes on him, all of them, from every table, 400 students, 15 teachers, 6 Durmstrang boys, 9 Beaubex girls, and he felt Stormbreaker's handle against his right knee where it rested against the bench, and the axe was very warm. Not angry warm. Steady warm, the warmth of something that is already deciding what comes next and is content to wait for the person holding it to catch up. He put down his pumpkin juice. He stood. The murmur that had started, the barely suppressed noise of 400 people beginning to react, changed quality when he stood, because he wasn't standing the way a 14-year-old stands when called out of turn in a room full of people. He wasn't hunching his shoulders or looking for permission. He picked up Stormbreaker from the bench and held it easily at his side and walked toward the staff table. Not running, not performing. Just walking in the specific way of someone who knows where they need to be and is going there. He heard Ron behind him, the sharp intake of breath. He heard Hermione say something very quietly that was probably his name. He didn't turn around. He walked the length of the hall and the noise followed him and then preceded him, the students at each table reacting as he passed, and he didn't look at any of them. He looked at Dumbledore, who was watching his approach with an expression Harry couldn't fully read, concern, yes, and the calculation, and underneath both of those something Harry had seen only rarely, something that he thought, if pressed, he might call guilt. Harry, Dumbledore said when he arrived at the staff table. Quietly, just for him. I didn't put my name in, Harry said, also quietly. I want that said clearly here in this hall. He turned to face the room. 400 faces turned toward him, the candles throwing their light, the bats still doing their circuits. He spoke in a voice that carried, not shouted, just projected with the clarity of someone who has always been looked at and has decided this time to choose what they see. I didn't enter my name, he said. Somebody did it for me, I don't know who or why yet. He paused, but I'll be finding out. He turned back to Dumbledore. Where do they want the champions? The side chamber off the Great Hall had the atmosphere of a place where important things have been happening for a long time, old tapestries, the faint smell of something that wasn't quite incense, 2 fireplaces, and a collection of chairs that had clearly not been arranged with this specific gathering in mind. Fleur de Lacquer occupied one side of the room with the elegant containment of someone who has been raised to manage public moments, and is doing so. Cedric Diggory occupied the other with the pleasant bewilderment of someone who is very good at most things, and is currently encountering something he has not been prepared for. Victor Crumb stood near a fireplace with his arms folded and the expression of a man who is making a careful and continuous effort not to have any expression at all. All 3 of them looked at Harry when he came in. All 3 looked at Stormbreaker. Crumb's eyes stayed on the axe for 3 full seconds before moving back to Harry's face, which was, Harry thought, probably the most expressive thing he'd seen Crumb do. They waited. Ludo Bagman arrived first, rotund, red-faced, with the energy of a man who has been excited about this tournament for 6 months, and has encountered an unexpected complication, and is choosing to be excited about that too. Karkaroff came behind him with the expression of someone rehearsing several conversations simultaneously. Madame Maxime from Beaubex arrived last, stooping through the doorway with the dignity of a very tall woman who has had long practice at doors designed for shorter people. And Dumbledore, and McGonagall. And Moody arriving from somewhere to Harry's left, which was odd because there had been no door on that side, and walking with his staff on the stones in that particular rhythmic way, his magical eye sweeping the room with a thoroughness that Harry had noticed in class and found useful, perhaps too useful, perhaps the kind of useful that should be examined more closely. Karkaroff immediately objected. Madame Maxime immediately objected. There was a great deal of back and forth about rules and precedent and the binding nature of magical contracts, and the meaning of the word champion and whether 4 champions was a thing the tournament rules could accommodate. And Harry stood in the middle of it and listened, and let them object because their objections were legitimate in isolation and irrelevant in the context he actually cared about. When there was a pause, a breath between objections, he said, "Someone put my name in to use me. I'd like to know who before we discuss anything else." The room went quiet in a different way. Moody was looking at him. Not the physical eye, the magical one, the one that saw through things that had been moving continuously since he'd entered. It was now fixed on Harry and not moving. Harry looked at Moody. And Stormbreaker went warm, not the steady warmth of readiness, not the warmth of comfort, but a specific directional warmth, the warmth of a compass finding north, the heat of something pointing. He looked at Moody very carefully. "The investigation into how this occurred will begin immediately," Dumbledore said. "Harry, for now the contract is binding, all 4 names are bound." "I understand," Harry said. "The first task is on November the 24th. "All right," Harry said. Karkaroff was staring at him. Madame Maxime was staring at him. Bagman was doing his excited weather face. Cedric Diggory was looking at him with the expression of someone reassessing their assumptions in real time, which Harry appreciated. Cedric was sharp, sharper than people gave him credit for. Fleur had the composure of a very good card player. Krum was looking at the axe. "We're done for tonight," Harry said. Dumbledore nodded. "For tonight." Harry left. Back through the Great Hall, which was still loud with the specific noise of a student body processing something extraordinary, and up the moving staircases and through the portrait hole and into Gryffindor Tower, where Ron and Hermione were waiting at the table near the fire with the expressions of 2 people who have been arguing with each other about whether to come find him and haven't resolved it. He sat down between them, put the axe against the table, looked at the fire. "Well," he said. "Well," Ron said. "Someone entered your name," Hermione said, because she was always going to be the one to say it plainly. "Someone wanted you in this tournament. Someone who knew the binding contract would hold regardless." She had her notebook out. "The same person who managed to fool or circumvent the goblet's own protective enchantments. Or someone who had access to the goblet before the enchantments were set," Harry said. She wrote something down. "Moody arrived before the other teachers," she said without looking up. "I noticed that at the feast. He was already in the hall when Dumbledore brought out the goblet." "I noticed that too," Harry said. Ron was looking between them with the expression he wore when they were moving faster than he'd expected. "Moody's a legend. He put away half the Death Eaters." "I know," Harry said. "You don't actually think—" "I think," Harry said carefully, "that something about Moody doesn't fit the rest of Moody, and I think the tournament isn't what it looks like. And I think someone went to a lot of trouble to put my name in a goblet that was supposed to be unfoolable." He paused. "I think we pay close attention and we don't assume anything." The fire crackled. Outside the common room windows, rain was beginning. A real autumn rain, the kind that comes in off the Scottish mountains and settles in for the night. Harry could feel it before he heard it, a change in the air pressure that had something to do with Stormbreaker and something to do with just having lived in this castle long enough to know its weather. The other Gryffindors were watching him from across the common room, not all of them, not rudely, but the way the room had reoriented itself slightly around where he was sitting, conversations angled toward him even if not including him. He recognized the sensation. It was the sensation of being the axis of a room, and he had always found it uncomfortable, and he was finding it less uncomfortable now not because he'd made peace with it, but because he had, on the bench in the Great Hall 2 hours ago, made a different decision. He wasn't going to manage how people saw him. He was going to be what he was, and what he was included the axe and the refusal to be moved by noise and the very clear intention of finding out who had done this and why. "Ron," he said. "Yeah, I need you to write to the twins. Ask them quietly if they noticed anything unusual about the goblet before Halloween, when people were submitting names. Anyone who seemed to be doing something more complicated than just dropping a piece of parchment." Ron looked at him. "You think someone was at the goblet?" "I think the enchantment was circumvented at submission, not at selection," Harry said. "The goblet selected honestly, it was given bad information." Ron picked up a quill. "On it." Hermione looked up from her notebook. In the firelight, her expression had the quality it got when she'd accepted a problem as a problem and was fully committed to it. Focused, sharp, very slightly dangerous in the specific way of people who are very intelligent and are angry about something. "Harry. Whatever this year is, whatever they planned, whoever they are, they didn't plan for that." She nodded at the axe. "No," he said, "they didn't." "Good," she returned to her notes. Harry leaned back in his chair. The rain was fully arrived now, heavy on the tower windows, and the fire threw warmth against his face, and Stormbreaker rested against the table with its quiet glow cycling through the impossible color, not silver, not blue, not moonlight, the markings patient and steady in the firelit dark. He thought about the year ahead, the tasks, the person who had put his name in the goblet and the purpose they'd had, and the long, careful chain of events they'd constructed to bring him here. He thought about what they expected from him, presumably a 14-year-old boy out of his depth, manageable. He thought about the dying star in his dream, the beauty and the scale of it, and the fact that he hadn't been afraid. He picked up the axe and felt the warmth of it settle into his hand, exactly as it always had, exactly right, exactly his, and looked at the fire and thought, not this year, not with this. Whatever was coming, it was going to find a different Harry than it was expecting. Chapter 3, Thunder Without Rain. The first task was dragons. Harry found out the same way he found out most things at Hogwarts that were meant to be secret. Through a combination of Hermione's research network, Ron's eavesdropping instincts, and a chain of events that began with Hagrid appearing at Harry's shoulder during care of magical creatures and saying, in the specific undertone of someone who has never once successfully whispered, "Come see me tonight, Harry. Got something to show ya." Hagrid's something turned out to be 4 dragons in enclosures the size of small warehouses at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, attended by a team of dragon handlers from Romania who looked like people who had made peace with danger so long ago that danger had stopped being a useful category for them. The dragons were a horntail, a shortsnout, a common Welsh green, and a Chinese fireball, and they were all magnificent and terrible in the way that things which have been alive and dangerous since before human beings had language tend to be. Harry had stood at the fence in the dark and looked at them for a long moment. "First task," Hagrid said, not really whispering anymore. "The champions have to get past 'em. Reckon you'll be all right, Harry." Harry looked at the horntail, specifically the largest, the one that was watching them from inside its enclosure with the focused attention of something that has assessed the perimeter and knows exactly where the weak points are. It had eyes like hammered bronze and a tail lined with spikes that it moved in a slow, deliberate sweep, keeping track of geometry. Smart, genuinely smart, the way all the most dangerous things were. "Yes," Harry said. "Oh, he'd meant it." That was the thing, he'd meant it immediately and without performance, which was a different feeling from the previous 2 years of yes, which had always contained somewhere inside them a small, but honest probably, or I think, or if nothing goes catastrophically wrong. This yes was clean. He went back to the castle and told Hermione, who had already worked out it was dragons through a process that involved 3 library books, a conversation with Charlie Weasley's friend who was one of the handlers, and a piece of reasoning so lateral Harry could only follow it in retrospect. She nodded when he confirmed it, closed the book she was reading, and said, "Broom?" "No," Harry said. She looked at him, he looked at her. "Harry, the broom is for when flight is the answer," he said. "I don't think flight is the answer." "What's the answer?" He thought about the dying star in his dream, the scale of it and the heat and the fact that he'd been unafraid. He thought about calling rain over the campsite fire. He thought about what Stormbreaker felt like when the weather shifted, the way the air pressure changes before a storm, and how, standing in Hagrid's pumpkin patch or on the Quidditch pitch or anywhere with sky above him, he could feel it now, faintly but certainly, like a new sense that had been there his whole life and was only now available to him. "I'll work it out," he said. "That's not a plan," Hermione said. "It's the start of one." She gave him the look. He gave her the steady look back. They held this for a moment, and then she pulled her notebook toward her and said, "Fine, tell me everything you know about how Stormbreaker responds to weather," he told her. All of it, the campsite rain, the shifts in the handle's warmth when pressure changed, the way it felt like being connected to something much larger than himself, not controlling it but in conversation with it. She wrote it all down in her precise handwriting and asked questions that cut to the mechanics of things in the way Hermione's questions always did, exposing the structure underneath the experience. By midnight, they had something that looked less like a plan and more like a framework, a set of observations, a set of capabilities, and a direction. Ron had been sitting through the discussion with his chin in his hands, his eyes going between them, and at the end of it he said, "You're going to walk in there and talk to the weather." "More or less," Harry said. "Against a dragon." "Yes." Ron was quiet for a moment. "Then you need to not die." "That's the general intention," Harry agreed. "I mean," Ron sat up. His voice had the quality it had sometimes, the raw quality that emerged when he stopped performing being casual about difficult things. "You know it's brilliant what you can do. The axe and the I know I've been a bit, Ron," Harry said. "I'm just saying." Ron looked at him directly. "Don't die." "I won't," Harry said. And that yes, that certainty, he gave that to Ron specifically because Ron needed it in a different way than Hermione needed it. Hermione needed logic and preparation. Ron needed to see that Harry was okay before he could be okay. Ron nodded, let out a breath, picked up his exploding snap cards. "Right, good. Now will you two stop talking about dragons so I can sleep?" The morning of November the 24th was the kind of morning that knows it's important. Sharp and cold, the sky a pale steel blue with no clouds, which should have meant no weather, no material to work with, and Harry had thought about this and decided it wasn't a problem. The clouds weren't the weather. The weather was the atmosphere, the pressure, the electricity living in the air even on clear days, the vast interconnected system of which clouds were only the visible parts. He'd been in the grounds at 6 in the morning, alone, to check. He'd stood on the frost-stiffened grass near the lake and held out his free hand, palm up, eyes closed, and paid attention. And it was there. The whole sky, the whole system, humming above him at a frequency that Stormbreaker translated into sensation the way a radio translates signal into sound. He could feel the cold front 200 miles to the north. He could feel the thermal differential over the lake. He could feel the specific electrical charge of a morning that looks clear but is coiled and waiting. He opened his eyes, looked at the castle, the towers, the light beginning in the windows. He thought about the arena they'd built on the edge of the grounds, the enclosures, the stands, the nest that would be placed in the center with the golden egg the champion needed to retrieve. He thought about a horntail. He went back inside for breakfast. The champions assembled in a tent at the edge of the arena at 9 o'clock. Fleur, composed and precisely prepared. Cedric, quiet in the way of someone managing nerves with genuine skill. Crumb, who appeared to have no nerves at all, or had them so perfectly contained that the containment itself looked like its absence. And Harry, who was the youngest and the smallest and the one without official entry, who stood slightly apart from the others and felt Stormbreaker warm and steady in his right hand. Bagman bounced in, drew the bag for order. Fleur drew first, Welsh green, Cedric the short snout, Crumb the fireball. Harry last reached into the bag and his fingers found a small Hungarian horntail, model of the actual one, bronze-eyed and spiked, and he held it in his palm and looked at it. He looked up and found Cedric watching him. Cedric had drawn a short snout and was holding his model with the careful grip of someone who has been doing risk assessment since the moment they found out it was dragons. His expression when he caught Harry's eyes was honest, concerned, and something else. "Are you all right?" Cedric asked, and he meant it genuinely, which was one of the reasons Harry found Cedric consistently easy to respect. "Yes," Harry said. "No broom." Cedric looked at the axe. "No broom." Cedric looked at the axe for a moment longer. He nodded slowly, with the nod of someone who doesn't fully understand but respects the decision anyway. "Good luck," he said, and he meant that genuinely too. "You too," Harry said. Fleur went first. Harry stayed in the tent and listened to the crowd, the roars, the commentary from Bagman that filtered through the canvas in fragments, the particular quality of noise that indicated whether something impressive or something alarming was happening. Fleur was in the arena for 7 minutes and came out with the egg and a burn on her hand that one of the Medi-Wizards attended to immediately. She sat down in the tent with the composed expression of someone who has been frightened and is not going to allow that to be visible, and Harry caught her eye and she gave him a short, precise nod. He returned it. Cedric went second, 12 minutes. He came back with the egg and singed hair and a look of shaken triumph that was absolutely genuine and entirely earned. Harry offered him a hand and Cedric shook it with a grip that said more than words would have. Crumb went third, 8 minutes. The crowd noise during his task was different, a specific quality of awe that recognized a virtuoso. The sound of people watching someone who has achieved a complete synthesis of intention and capability. He came back with the egg and the same expression he did going in, which was either extraordinary composure or evidence that he'd experienced the whole thing on a level where emotion wasn't the primary register. He looked at Harry on his way past. The look was brief and completely unreadable, and Harry filed it for later. Then Bagman was at the tent flap and saying, "Harry, ready?" with the enormous enthusiasm of a man who has been looking forward to this specific event since Halloween and is not going to pretend otherwise. "Yes," Harry said. He walked out of the tent. The arena was bigger than it looked from outside. That was always the way with magical spaces. The physical dimensions were a suggestion rather than a commitment. The stands were full, the full school plus what looked like the entire population of both visiting schools. And above the stands the morning sky sat clear and pale and full of coiled, waiting electricity. Harry walked to the center of the arena and stopped. The horntail was in the far end, chained. The chains were heavy and practical and clearly well maintained by people who knew what a horntail could do with slack, with its nest beside it and the gold of the dragon's egg catching the morning light from inside the nest. The dragon was already watching him, had been watching him since the tent flap opened, probably. Those bronze eyes tracked him with the focused intelligence of something that has been in this arena for 2 days and has been furious about it for the entirety of that time. Bagman's voice, amplified by some spell, went through the standard explanation for the crowd, the task, the objective, the scoring. Harry didn't listen. He was looking at the horntail, and the horntail was looking at him. The crowd was very loud, and then it wasn't, not because it stopped, but because Harry stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing background noise when you focus completely. He was aware of it the way he was aware of the cold of the morning, and the hardness of the ground under his feet, and the weight of Stormbreaker in his right hand, present but not demanding. He thought this is an animal that's been chained and transported and put in a small space and is frightened and angry and would like nothing more than to be somewhere else. It's not evil. It's not a villain. It's a creature doing exactly what it was made to do. He thought, don't fight the dragon. Don't fight it like an enemy. Fight it like a problem. He looked at the sky. He breathed in long and slow and felt the atmosphere above him, the electrical charge of the clear morning, the cold front to the north that was closer than it had been at 6 o'clock, the thermal differential over the arena that was being amplified by the heat of 100 body temperatures in the stands. He felt the system. And he reached up into it, not with his hand, not with the axe, but with that sense that Stormbreaker had opened or perhaps simply revealed, and he pulled. Not much, not catastrophically. He asked the sky for something specific and small, a sound. The thunderclap came from directly above the arena. No cloud, no storm, no rain, just the electrical discharge of the atmosphere doing something the atmosphere had the energy to do and had simply needed direction. And the sound of it was enormous in the way that only thunder is enormous, the full chest impact of it. And the horntail reacted the way animals always react to sudden, overwhelming sound. It pulled back, it tucked, its wings coming in and its neck going lower. The 3 seconds of confusion that follows something a nervous system recognizes as much larger than me. Harry was already moving. He didn't run. He moved at pace, sure-footed, covering the ground between himself and the nest while the dragon was still recalibrating. He called the thunder twice more, targeted from specific points above the arena, moving the sound around the dragon's perception to keep its attention diffuse, and each time it reacted, pulling back, wings defensive, the instinctive confusion of a creature being told by its nervous system that there is something dangerous and not being able to locate it. He reached the nest. The golden egg was heavy, more than it looked, and warm as if it were alive. He closed his left hand around it and felt it resist for a moment and then come free, and he turned. The horntail had recovered its position. It was looking at him now with the specific quality of a very intelligent animal that has been confused and is angry about it and has now identified the source. The bronze eyes were fixed on Harry. The tail was moving in that slow, geometry-tracking sweep. Harry looked at it, the golden egg in his left hand, Stormbreaker in his right. He was still on the wrong side of the arena from the exit. The horntail opened its mouth. Harry threw Stormbreaker upward, straight up, hard, into the clear cold sky and ducked. The fireball went over him, close enough that he felt the heat of it across his back and the back of his neck in a wave that was nearly solid, the specific heat of something genuinely dangerous. He'd felt it coming. Stormbreaker's warmth had gone directional in the half-second before the dragon released, the way a compass needle swings, and he'd moved on the instinct before the thought had formed. Stormbreaker came back to his right hand from directly above. He hadn't looked. Hadn't needed to. He felt it arriving and his hand was there, and the handle hit his palm with the familiar impact of something landing exactly where it was going, and he was already running. Not away from the dragon. Parallel to it. The chains gave the horntail a radius, and Harry had estimated the radius and was running the edge of it inside tight where the dragon couldn't get proper leverage. The tail came around and he leaped it. It was lower at this range, shorter arc landed running. Another fireball, this one wide because the angle was wrong and the dragon knew it, and it was recalibrating, pivoting on the chains to get a better line. Harry hit the wall of the arena at speed and went up it. The footholds were arbitrary and not really footholds, but he made them work. 3 running steps up the wall before momentum failed, and then the exit platform was within reach, and he grabbed the edge of it and pulled himself up and rolled onto the platform and lay on his back with the golden egg on his chest and Stormbreaker across his body and looked at the clear cold sky above the arena. The crowd was very loud. He could hear it now. He lay there for a moment and breathed. Assessed, no injuries. The heat on the back of his neck would probably redden but hadn't burned. His hands were whole. The egg was in one piece. He sat up. The stands were on their feet. All of them not in sections, not in houses, but entirely, the whole crowd standing in the specific unanimous way that only happens when something has been extraordinary enough to transcend loyalty. He could see, from the platform, specific faces. Hermione, who had both hands over her mouth and was crying and wasn't going to acknowledge it. Ron, who had apparently been grabbing Dean Thomas's arm and hadn't noticed yet, and was going to be embarrassed about it in about 30 seconds. Neville, standing with an expression of transparent, uncomplicated joy. The Beaubaix girls on their feet talking rapidly to each other. At the judge's table, Dumbledore with his hands folded in front of him and an expression that Harry, even from this distance, could read as something more than professional assessment. Karkaroff scowling, Maxime impressive and considering, Bagman practically airborne with excitement. And Moody standing slightly separate from the judges, he was staff, not a judge, was watching from the edge of the stands with his magical eye fixed on Harry from across the arena. The physical eye was doing something careful and unreadable. The magical one hadn't moved since Harry came out of the tent. Harry looked at him for a moment. The warmth in Stormbreaker was directional again, that compass quality, pointing, insistent. He looked away. The scores went up, 9 from Dumbledore, 8 from Maxime, which was fair given she was representing a competing school, 6 from Karkaroff, which made the crowd express its opinion immediately and without restraint, 9 from Bagman, 9 from the fifth judge, Mr. Crouch, who had been so still and remote throughout the proceedings that Harry had almost forgotten he was there. First place overall. Harry looked at the scores and felt, not the surge of triumph he might have expected, but the specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly. The quiet click of right. The aftermath of the first task had the quality of an incoming tide, slow at first and then suddenly everywhere. The congratulations came in waves, starting with the Gryffindors and spreading outward through school geography and social logic, until even a few Slytherins had offered nods that carried an acknowledgement they couldn't completely disguise as contempt. The noteworthy exceptions were Malfoy and, more interestingly, Krum. Malfoy's response to Harry's first task performance was something Harry watched with careful attention, because Malfoy's responses were always diagnostic of something. He was transparent in the specific way of people who are performing opacity, the effort showing through the performance in ways he couldn't see. The contempt was still there, but it had been reorganized around something newer and larger. Harry had seen this in Malfoy occasionally over the years, the specific response of someone whose worldview has been hit by something it can't categorize. Malfoy believed, fundamentally and at great depth, in power as a currency. It was the value system he'd been raised in, the logic that governed his entire understanding of hierarchy. Harry had never fit that system cleanly, too powerful to dismiss, wrong blood, wrong family, the wrong kind of famous, and Stormbreaker had complicated the equation further in a way Malfoy was visibly working through. The contempt required Harry to be manageable. Stormbreaker made him less manageable. These two things were in conflict, and Draco Malfoy, for all his performance of certainty, was fundamentally a person who found irresolvable conflicts very difficult. Harry didn't push it. He didn't taunt or engage. He just existed in the space where Malfoy's worldview kept running into him and let the friction do its work. Krum was different. He appeared beside Harry at the library 2 days after the first task, which required a degree of intention because the library was not a place Victor Krum frequented. This was evident from the expression on Madame Pince's face when he walked in, the specific expression of a librarian encountering someone she is not accustomed to seeing. He sat down across from Harry without asking, which would have been rude from anyone else, and from Krum was simply direct. The transactional honesty of a person who doesn't have the patience for social preliminary. The thunder, he said. Harry looked up from his transfiguration essay. Yes, you did not summon your broom, Krum said. Any of the others would have summoned a broom. I would have used my broom. Your firebolt, Harry said. Something shifted in Krum's face, not quite surprise, but the acknowledgement that he'd been recognized accurately. Yes, he looked at Stormbreaker, which was leaning against the table beside Harry. That calls weather. Among other things, Harry said. Krum was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the axe with the expression of someone performing a very precise assessment. I have seen magical objects, he said. In Bulgaria there are old things, old magic. I know what it is to be near something that has history. He paused. That has more history than most. Yes, Harry said, it chose you. Yes, Krum leaned back. He had the quality, Harry thought, of someone who spent so much time being observed that he'd developed a perfect conservation of expression. He showed only exactly what he intended to show, and what he was intending to show right now was something approaching honesty. At Durmstrang, he said, we are taught that power belongs to those who take it. That ownership is proof of worthiness. He looked at Harry. I don't think that axe agrees. No, Harry said, it doesn't. Neither do I in the end, Krum said. It came out quietly, like a confession he hadn't fully planned to make but had made because the moment was the right one. Then he stood. You fought the Horntail correctly, not by defeating it, by not fighting it. It wasn't trying to be evil, Harry said. It was just scared. Krum looked at him for a moment, then he nodded once with the nod that carried more weight than most people's speeches and left the library. Madame Pince watched him go with an expression caught between relief and offense. Harry returned to his transfiguration essay and thought about what Krum had said about Durmstrang, about power belonging to those who take it, and about Karkaroff, and about the mark on Karkaroff's arm that Moody had pointed out in class, and about the chain of things he was assembling link by link. He thought about Voldemort, who was the end point of that chain, the person who believed most completely that power was proven by taking, who had spent his entire existence acquiring power by claiming it from others. He thought about the dying star. You didn't take a dying star. You stood in front of it and let it decide what you were. 2,000 miles south, in a manor house in an English county that appeared on no Muggle map and which had been struck from the Wizarding Registry 40 years ago by official decree, Voldemort sat. He sat because standing required effort and effort was being conserved. The body was still new and imperfect, the ritual was not yet complete, the restoration only partial, sustained by magic and Nagina's milk and Wormtail's devotion, which was itself a somewhat unreliable energy source. But the mind had always been his real residence, and the mind was fully occupied. He had two sources on the school. Wormtail had contacts. And then there was his connection to the boy, the scar, the thin corridor of awareness that had existed since that night in Godric's Hollow. It was unreliable and could not be directed, but sometimes when the boy's emotions ran high, it opened like a window. He had felt the first task. Distantly, imprecisely, but he had felt it. The thunder. The size of what the boy had called from a clear sky. He had been sitting with this information for 2 days. Across the room, Wormtail stood with his silver hand clasped in front of him, not quite looking at his master. The manor was cold in the way of buildings that have been empty for decades, a deep structural cold that no fire could fully address. "Tell me again," Voldemort said. His voice was still not everything it had been, too thin, too little resonance. He resented it. "What the sources confirm." "The weapon," Wormtail said in the voice he used when he was very frightened and trying not to show it, which was most of his voices. "An Asgardian artifact, pre-wizarding in origin." "The scholars, I know what the scholars say," Voldemort said. "The scholars have been writing about the 9 realms for a century and have never understood them because they approach the question as wizards. Magic is one system, there are others." He looked at the fire. "The axe operates on a principle of worthiness. The literature is consistent on this, which means it cannot be stolen, cannot be enchanted to obey another, cannot be negated by conventional magic." "Then how?" "I am not interested in taking it," Voldemort said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a person he has decided is necessary rather than useful. "I never intended to take it. What the axe does changes the terrain, it does not change the destination." He looked at his hands. "The plan proceeds, the final task, the portkey, the ritual." He was quiet for a moment. "Boy will arrive in the graveyard with an Asgardian weapon and full use of his abilities. But then it will be a real fight," Voldemort said, "rather than the slaughter of a surprised child." He said this without emotion, purely analytically. "And I will have what I was denied 14 years ago, a true confrontation, body against body, power against power." He looked into the fire and something moved in his red eyes that was not heat but was its cousin. "I have never lost a true fight. I have only been ambushed by the unexpected." He let the fire fill the silence for a moment. "Prepare the graveyard, I want everything ready by June." Wormtail left quickly in the style of someone who has been told to leave and takes the permission seriously. Voldemort looked into the fire. He thought about the boy who had called thunder from a clear sky, and the axe that an entire cosmology had decided he was worthy of, and the green eyes that kept looking at things steadily, quietly, without permission, without fear. He thought, "Good, be ready, I want you ready." And underneath that thought, in a place so deep he almost didn't register it, something that in anyone else would have been anticipation. Harry noticed Moody noticing him. Not the way students noticed him, the rubbernecking, the pointing, the social current of the school reorganizing around his presence. Moody noticed him the way a threat notices something it's been tasked to manage, with the specific attention of preparation. In defense class, where Moody was genuinely extraordinary, the lessons were the best Harry had experienced. The practical exercises real, the combat technique exact and useful. He gave Harry specific attention that could be read as the special interest a teacher gives a promising student. But the attention was directional. It was always slightly in front of where Harry was going rather than where he was, like someone tracking a target. Harry sat in defense class on the Thursday after the first task and performed exactly as much of his capability as he wanted Moody to see, which was less than his actual capability. This was not hiding. This was the basic intelligence of someone who knows they're being watched and adjusts what they display accordingly, not to deceive exactly, but to maintain the gap between what the observer thinks they know and what is actually true. Stormbreaker was warm and directional every time Moody's magical eye found it. He told Hermione that evening in the library. She didn't say anything immediately. She was looking at the notes she'd been making for 2 weeks. The deep research dive into Asgardian texts that had expanded to include pre-Roman magical theory, 3 obscure volumes she'd had owled from the British Museum's Magical Archive, and a set of runic translation worksheets that were now covering an entire corner of the table. "I've found something," she said. "About Stormbreaker, specifically." He waited. "There are references in the oldest texts, the ones that aren't really about the weapons at all, they're about the principles behind them, to a quality the weapons carry that I've been trying to translate accurately." She turned her notebook toward him. The page had runic symbols with her annotations beneath each one, and at the bottom a sentence underlined 3 times. The best translation I can manage is, "It knows the weight of what is hidden." Harry looked at the sentence. "Meaning it can detect deception? More than detect," she said. "These texts describe the weapon as oriented, like a compass toward magnetic north but toward truth, toward authenticity." She tapped the page. "It's not that it can identify lies. It's that it responds to the gap between what something is and what it presents itself as." "Like a false face," Harry said. "Exactly like a false face." Harry sat with that. He thought about the warmth in Stormbreaker's handle when Moody's eye found them. He thought about the directional quality of it, not just Moody but something about Moody, some gap between the surface and what was underneath. He thought about arriving at the first task tent and Moody being there before the other teachers, which wasn't what you expected from someone whose role was as a professor rather than a tournament official. He thought about the magical eye that saw through things, through robes, through walls, through whatever came between it and what it wanted to know, and what it meant that someone with that eye had apparently not seen the flaw in his own cover. Unless the cover was the eye, unless the eye was itself the performance. "Hermione," he said carefully, "is there a spell that could substitute one person for another completely, not just appearance, voice, memories, mannerisms?" She looked at him. "Polyjuice potion," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet. "Long-term use would be extremely difficult. The magical strain alone," she stopped, started again. "You'd need continuous access to the real person's hair. You'd need to be able to replicate their knowledge well enough to perform their role. And Moody is," she stopped again. "Moody is a legend, a career orer, decades of knowledge and technique. If you had access to the real Moody," Harry said, "long-term, and you were given enough time to study him." The library was very quiet around them. "You'd need to keep him alive," she said. "For the hair, continuous supply." Harry thought about the magical trunk Moody had in his office. The one with 7 locks, which he'd seen on one occasion from the corridor, and which Moody kept locked with what Harry had assessed as a very specific and personal level of attention. Not the professional attention of a teacher protecting school property. The personal attention of someone protecting something they cannot allow discovered. He picked up Stormbreaker. The handle was warm, directionless now, not pointing, just warm, patient. "We need to be careful," he said. "If we're right, whoever is in there is working for Voldemort. They're here for a reason, and the reason is the tournament, and the reason is me. If they find out we know, they'll accelerate," Hermione said. "Change the plan," or she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Don't tell anyone yet," Harry said. "Not even Ron, not because I don't trust him. I know," she said. "Fewer people knowing means fewer ways for it to get back. We need evidence," Harry said. "Something concrete." "The trunk," she said. "The trunk," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that getting to the trunk meant getting into Moody's office, which meant getting past the real Moody, or whoever was wearing Moody's face, without triggering whatever alarm system a paranoid career dark wizard catcher would have installed. "After Christmas," Harry said. "We have time. The final task isn't until June." "He won't expect us to know," Hermione said. "That's our advantage." "That's our advantage," Harry agreed. He stood, collected Stormbreaker, and walked with her out of the library into the corridor. The castle was in its evening mode, torches lit, students moving between dinner and common rooms, the sound of distant laughter and the specific creak of the third-floor staircase that always sounded like it was about to give way and never did. Normal, everything ordinary. Harry walked through it and thought about dragons and thunder and the gap between what things presented themselves as and what they were, and about a wooden trunk with 7 locks in a room 2 floors above him, and about the long, patient intelligence of something that had been working toward June for a long time. He thought about being ready. At the entrance to Gryffindor Tower, Neville Longbottom was waiting with an expression that combined excitement and embarrassment in the specific ratio that meant he was about to ask something he'd been working up to for a while. "Harry," Neville said, I wanted to say, the first task, the thunder." He stopped, started again. "My gran watched it in the leaky cauldron. They did a live scrying and she said," he stopped again and his ears went red. "What did she say, Neville?" "She said it was the most extraordinary thing she'd seen since the war." Neville's voice came out quieter than he'd intended. "She said it like it was a good thing." He looked at Harry with the transparent sincerity that was the most distinctive thing about him. "I just wanted you to know." Harry looked at him. "Thank you, Neville," he said, and meant it in the specific way you mean things that are simple and true. Neville nodded, going redder, and disappeared through the portrait hole. Harry stood at the entrance for a moment. He thought about Augusta Longbottom watching a scrying crystal in the leaky cauldron and seeing a 14-year-old call thunder from a clear sky, and he thought about what it meant that a woman who had survived the First War and raised the boy she'd raised called it extraordinary and meant it as something good rather than something frightening. He thought, that's what this is for, not the glory, not the scores, not the eternal fame of the tournament. the look on Neville's face. The voice of a grandmother saying extraordinary like it was a gift rather than a warning. He went through the portrait hole into the warm noise of the common room and sat with Ron, who had saved him a seat by the fire, and Hermione, who had arrived from the library approximately 30 seconds before him and was already reading. And he sat between his two best friends in the firelit common room and felt the warmth of Stormbreaker against his leg, and the warmth of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Outside, the Scottish sky had clouded over. He could feel it, the weather building, the atmosphere thickening with the promise of snow that was still 2 days away but already present in the electrical quality of the cold. He could feel it the way he felt his own heartbeat now, constant background the fire crackled. Ron was saying something about the cannons. Hermione was making a note in the margin of something. The common room was warm and ordinary and alive. Harry closed his eyes for a moment and felt the whole sky above the castle, felt it the way Stormbreaker taught him to feel it, as a system, as something vast and interconnected and full of potential energy waiting for direction. And then he opened his eyes and picked up his charms essay and started writing. The snow would come in 2 days, and with it December, and with December the Yule Ball, and with the Yule Ball a set of conversations that would pull things into the open and out of them again. And beyond that, beyond December, the second task and the third, and the chain of events building toward June. He was ready for all of it, not unafraid, but ready. The distinction mattered. Chapter 4. The weight of Worth. The snow arrived exactly when Harry had felt it coming. 2 days after the first task, in the grey hours before breakfast, it came down in the specific heavy way of Scottish winter snow. Not decorative, not the light dusting that lasted an hour on the grounds and delighted the first years, but real snow, committed snow. The kind that settled on the windowsills in thick ridges and turned the grounds into something vast and white and stripped of detail. Harry woke to it without an alarm, lying in his four-poster in the dark dormitory with Stormbreaker's glow the only light, and listened to the muffled quality of a world that has been insulated overnight. He lay there for a while thinking about the second task. The golden egg had been sitting on his bedside table since the first task, and he'd opened it twice, once alone and once with Hermione, and both times the sound it made was the same. A shrieking, wailing, layered noise that was completely uninterpretable to human ears. Hermione had spent 3 evenings trying to decode it through research and had arrived at a theory that required the egg to be opened underwater, which she'd presented with the expression of someone who is confident in their conclusion and annoyed that the conclusion is inconvenient. Underwater, Harry had said. Underwater, she'd confirmed. He'd thought about this intermittently since. The second task was in February, which gave him nearly 3 months, which was 3 months more than he'd had for the first task. And he was trying to resist the impulse to consider himself ahead of the problem because he'd learned enough from 3 years of Hogwarts to know that the problems which seemed manageable in December were the ones that arrived in a different shape than expected. He rolled onto his back and looked at the ceiling. The snowlight was beginning to filter through the window, that specific blue-white quality of morning in a snowbound landscape. The dormitory was quiet except for Ron's breathing, which had the steady rhythm of someone who would sleep until approximately 30 seconds before breakfast with a consistency that Harry had always found genuinely impressive. The Yule Ball, he thought, that was the immediate problem. He needed a partner for the Yule Ball. As a champion, he was required to open the dancing, which required both a partner and some degree of ability to dance, and he had neither. He'd been putting off thinking about this with the specific avoidance strategy of someone who knows a problem is coming, and has decided that ignoring it will somehow reduce the damage it can do. This strategy had never once worked in his life, and he was employing it anyway. He thought about who he could ask. He thought about Cho Chang, which produced a specific and complicated response that was not exactly nervousness and not exactly excitement, but was somewhere in the vicinity of both, with an undertow of something else he didn't have a word for yet. Cho was a year above him, a Ravenclaw seeker of genuine skill, and she had smiled at him on 2 occasions that he'd been cataloging with more attention than he was entirely comfortable admitting. She was also, he knew, likely to be asked by approximately 40 other people before he got there. He thought about just asking someone he was comfortable with and arriving at the ball without the complicated undertow, and then thought about who that would be, and worked out that Hermione was out for a dozen reasons and the other girls he knew well enough were either taken already or would require a conversation about expectations that felt more complicated than the problem it solved. He got up, got dressed, picked up Stormbreaker and went down to the common room. Ginny Weasley was already there, sitting in front of the fire in her pajamas with a book, which was, Harry had been noticing this more as the year went on, something she did when she wanted to read without being surrounded by people and had calculated correctly that the common room at 6:30 in the morning was essentially empty. She looked up when he came down the stairs and said, "You couldn't sleep either." "Slept fine," Harry said. "I just wake up early." She looked at the snow on the windows. "It's proper this time." "Yes." He sat in the chair across from the fire. She went back to her book. The fire was low and amber and the snow was blue-white at the window, and the common room had that quality it only had in the very early morning, the feeling of a space that belongs to itself rather than to the people who occupy it. "Ginny," he said after a few minutes, "will you go to the Yule Ball with me?" She looked up. He'd surprised her, he could tell from the quality of the look, the half-second of recalibration. Then she gave him the Frank Weasley assessment, the look that her brothers all did too in their own versions, and said, "As friends?" "Yes," he said. Unless he stopped because he hadn't worked out what the end of that sentence was, and Ginny was perceptive enough that a half-finished sentence was as informative as a complete one. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression, complicated and then less complicated and then settled. "Neville's already asked me," she said. "I said yes." "Oh," Harry said. "Good Neville's, he really is," she said warmly. "You should ask Cho Chang." He looked at her. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me," she said, which he suspected was generous but accepted. "And possibly Hermione." She returned to her book. "Ask her today before someone else does." Ask Cho Chang that afternoon between classes in the corridor outside Charms, which was not the ideal venue but was the venue that presented itself. She was with two of her friends, which was also not ideal, and he was holding Stormbreaker, which was, well, it was always there. He said, "Cho, I wondered if you'd go to the ball with me." She looked at him. Her friends looked at him. One of them looked at the axe. Cho said, "I'm sorry, Harry, I've already said yes to Cedric." "Oh," Harry said. "I'm sorry," she said again, and meant it, which was not especially comforting but was at least honest. He said, "No, that's Cedric's great. Have a good time," and walked away without a scene, which he was fairly pleased about, and found Ron around the corner looking sympathetic in the way of someone who had been eavesdropping by accident and hadn't had time to move before the conversation resolved. "Cedric," Ron said. "Yes," Harry said. "Right," Ron thought about it. "Hermione? Number, why not?" "Because she's Hermione," Harry said, which Ron apparently found sufficient. They walked in silence for a moment, and then Ron said, "I haven't asked anyone either. We should probably sort that out." "Yes," Ron agreed, with the expression of someone agreeing to tackle a problem they would prefer to pass to someone else. The Great Hall for the Yule Ball was McGonagall's idea of Christmas having a formal argument with itself and both sides winning. Every surface had been transformed, the usual long house tables replaced with smaller round ones, the walls draped in silver, the enchanted ceiling doing something with ice crystals and starlight that made the room look like being inside a snow globe. The Weird Sisters were tuning up on a raised stage at the far end, and the combined noise of 400 students in formal dress arriving at a ball they'd been anticipating for a month created its own weather system. Harry arrived with Parvati Patil, who had agreed with the efficiency of someone who had not been asked yet, and had run out of patience for the situation. She was in robes of deep pink that were genuinely striking, and she was clearly hoping for a good evening, which Harry felt a genuine obligation to provide, and which was slightly complicated by the fact that his attention kept going in several different directions simultaneously. He was wearing his dress robes, new ones, which Mrs. Weasley had sent along with a note that said simply, "You deserve nice things." Harry in her firm, warm handwriting, and which were a dark green that Hermione had approved with two words, "Actually perfect." Stormbreaker was not at the ball in the sense of being carried. He'd left it in the dormitory for the evening, which was the first time since August he'd been without it, and the absence was noticeable in the way that removing something you've been wearing for months is noticeable. Not wrong, just aware. He found their seats, made introductions, and was working his way through the opening small talk when Hermione arrived. He'd known Hermione for 4 years. He knew the person underneath the research and the correct answers, and the hand always raised. But the person who walked into the Yule Ball on Victor Crumb's arm with her hair pinned up and her robes a deep periwinkle blue he didn't have the word for it, except that it was the first time he'd seen Hermione arrive somewhere and the room notice her in a different way than it noticed Harry, which was the way of noticing something you hadn't seen before that had been there all along. Ron's response was audible from 6 feet away. Not words, a specific sound, involuntary and immediately suppressed, that said everything words would have over-explained. Harry looked at Ron. Ron looked at Harry. Harry looked away because it was the kind thing to do. Crumb guided Hermione through the room with the focused, comfortable attention of someone who is accustomed to high-profile rooms and is not currently paying attention to the room. He was paying attention to Hermione, which Harry found, after a moment of assessment, genuinely good. He filed a note to tell her later. The champion's opening dance was, well. Harry had had 4 lessons from McGonagall in the week leading up to the ball. Lessons which she had conducted with the grim efficiency of someone who has been asked to do something she considers beneath the dignity of the occasion, but is going to do well regardless. He could now waltz in the technical sense of executing the steps without causing injury to his partner. Whether it could be called dancing in any emotional or expressive sense was a question he left open. Parvati was a good dancer and patient with him, which helped. He got through it. At some point, the floor filled up, and the Weird Sisters began the portion of the evening that was actually music rather than choreography, and Harry found himself in the approximate middle of the crowd in the approximate middle of the evening and breathed. He looked around. He spotted Cedric with Cho. They were laughing at something and it looked easy and good, and Harry felt something that was not quite envy and not quite relief but was in the vicinity of both. He spotted Neville and Ginny, and whatever Neville had done for his dancing in the intervening week had worked. He was moving with something approaching confidence, and Ginny was smiling genuinely. He spotted Ron, who had asked Padma Patil in the same desperate last-minute spirit as Harry had asked Parvati, and who was currently not talking to Padma but staring at the space where Hermione and Krum had been dancing 10 minutes ago, and whose expression was the specific expression of a person who is understanding something about themselves they weren't expecting and is not equipped for the timing. Harry went to find Hermione because Hermione would want to know what he'd noticed, and because there was also the matter of what she'd found. She was near the far wall, momentarily alone. Krum had gone to deal with a cluster of students who'd surrounded him and was handling it with the practiced composure of someone who had signed many autographs. She had her research expression on despite being at a ball, which meant she'd been thinking about it all evening. "I found more," she said when he reached her. "I know you have the look." "What look?" "The look where you're at a social event but you're actually in the library." She looked at him. "I'm at a perfectly social event. Hermione, you've been here 2 hours and you're waiting to tell me something." She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her robes. "I found another reference. In one of the volumes from the museum archive, a pre-Roman text that was filed incorrectly as Norse mythology, it was actually a record. A record, Harry, historical documentation, about Stormbreaker, about the process of worthiness selection." She lowered her voice slightly, though the music was loud enough to cover them comfortably. "It describes several previous wielders, not by name, the names have been lost or were never recorded, but by type. The qualities that the selection identified." She met his eyes. "The pattern, Harry, every single one, they had all lost something fundamental in their lives, not just faced loss. Lost something that should have broken them, that would have broken most people, and chose to remain." She paused. "The text describes it as those who have been emptied and did not fill the emptiness with bitterness." The music shifted around them, the Weird Sisters moving into something slower. Harry stood with that for a moment. He felt the absence of Stormbreaker at his back, the awareness of it left behind in the dormitory, and thought about what it meant to be without the thing that had been there every day since August, and found that the space it left was not empty. He was still himself without it, which was, he thought, probably the point. "Your parents," Hermione said quietly. Not asking, just saying. "Yes," he said, "and the Dursleys and everything since." "Yes. You should know that," she said. "Not because I'm not trying to make it into something neat. It isn't neat, but you should know that what it chose wasn't just you. It chose what you've been willing to do with what happened to you. That's..." She stopped. Her voice had done something it rarely did, wavered slightly at the edge of something real. "That matters, Harry," he looked at her. "Thank you," he said, "and meant it in the way you mean things that are both simple and enormous." She straightened, composing herself back into Hermione. "Also," she said, "I think you should know that Ron has been staring at me all evening and I'm choosing not to notice, but I do notice, and I don't know what to do about that, and I would appreciate it if you also didn't make me talk about it right now." "Noted," Harry said. "Good." She smoothed her robes again. "Go rescue Parvati. She's been talking to Lavender for 20 minutes, which means she's bored." He went. Later, past midnight, with the ball winding down and the Great Hall beginning its slow return to ordinary, Harry found himself outside on the stone steps that led to the grounds, which were white and silent and enormous under a sky that had cleared to a deep winter black full of stars. He'd stepped out for air and found that the air was the good kind, cold and clean and full of the specific hush of a snow-covered world. He sat on the top step and let his breath cloud in front of him and thought about what Hermione had told him, and about loss and the shape it leaves and what you choose to put in that shape. He heard footsteps behind him and the door opened. Ron sat down beside him. Not immediately talking, which was unusual, but Ron was in a specific kind of mood that Harry recognized. The mood that followed Ron understanding something about himself that he'd been avoiding and sitting with it and not yet knowing what to do. They sat in silence for a minute. The grounds were white and the sky was black and cold. She looked brilliant, Ron said finally. Yes, Harry said. She always looks, she's always, Ron stopped, started again. I'm an idiot. Sometimes, Harry said, about this specifically a bit, yes. When did that happen? I think it's been happening for a while, Harry said. You're just noticing now, Ron was quiet. He was pulling at his dress robes in the specific way he pulled at things when he was uncomfortable. Crumb, he said with the specific inflection that contained an entire complicated paragraph. He's decent, Harry said. I know that's annoying. Massively annoying, Ron agreed. He looked at the snow. She's not, she'd never, I'm not saying, Ron. What? You could just tell her, Harry said. That's the thing people do. Ron looked at him with the expression of someone being presented with a concept they find both obvious and impossibly difficult. That easy? Not easy, Harry said. Just that thing. Ron pulled at his robes. What if she doesn't? Then at least you know, Harry said. Either way you know. He looked at the sky. Not knowing is the bit that's doing the damage. Ron was quiet for a long time then. Is this the axe talking? Has it made you wise or something? Harry looked at him. That's not wisdom, that's just obvious. Felt wise, Ron said. They sat there in the cold for a while. Somewhere inside the castle, the Weird Sisters were playing something slow. The snow reflected the castle lights in a faint amber glow that made the grounds look warmer than they were. Harry, Ron said, I want to say something and I need you to let me say it without making it weird. All right, Ron looked at his hands. I've been since the campsite, since the first task. I've been a bit in my head about it. About the difference between, he stopped, tried again. You know what it's like, growing up Weasley, 7 of us and all of them, Bill's curse-breaking, Charlie's dragons, Percy's ministry thing, Fred and George are going to be legends, Ginny's, he waved a hand. And I'm the 6th Ron Weasley, you know, and then there's you and you've always been, you're Harry. He said the name the way you say the name of something that is both familiar and significant, and for a while this year I was being rubbish about it. I know, Harry said. He didn't dress it up or deny it. I'm sorry, Ron said. I know that too, Harry said. They sat there and let that settle in the way that real things settle, not resolved exactly but acknowledged, which is the first step toward resolved. For what it's worth, Harry said, the axe doesn't make me better than you. It makes me better at what I was already doing. You're brilliant at entirely different things. Ron made a dismissive sound. No, I mean it, Harry said. You see patterns in situations I miss. You understand people, not individually. You're terrible at individual people sometimes. Ron made an offended sound. But in groups, in dynamics, the way a room works, the way a plan will play out. That's strategy, Ron, actual strategy. Ron was quiet. Also, Harry said, you're the best chess player I've ever seen, and that is directly applicable to every dangerous situation we have ever been in. Ron laughed, an actual laugh, sudden and genuine. That's the most you've ever said about me in one go. Don't get used to it, Harry said. They went back inside. December moved through the castle in the way of things that are running out. The snow settling in for its long stay. The holidays arriving to empty half the school. Harry stayed, he always stayed. Privet Drive at Christmas was comprehensively worse than an empty castle, and Ron stayed. And Hermione went home to her parents but wrote 3 times in the week she was gone. The letters progressively longer and more research-dense as she apparently ran out of patience for a holiday without access to a proper library. Crumb wrote to her. Harry knew this because Hermione mentioned it exactly once. In passing, in the tone of someone who is mentioning something they've decided is factual rather than significant. He was going to tell her what he'd said to Ron about just telling people things, and then didn't, because Hermione would get there in her own way, and her own way was usually correct even if it was slow. The holidays were good. The castle in its half-empty state had a different quality. You could hear your own footsteps. The echoes had space to develop, and Peeves, without a full school to torment, focused his attention with a precision that was almost flattering. Harry spent mornings in the grounds working with Stormbreaker, the snow-covered pitch giving him space to practice things he couldn't do in the castle, throwing, the long distances, the weather work, pushing at the edges of what he understood about the axe's capabilities. On the day before Christmas, he went to the prefect's bathroom on the 5th floor with the golden egg. The bathroom was, as Cedric had hinted at by way of apology for the Cho situation, which Harry had appreciated, it was the kind of decent thing you didn't have to do, extraordinary. The bath was practically a swimming pool, the hundreds of taps producing various scented and colored bubbles, and the mermaid in the painting looked bored in the specific way of people who have been watching other people be impressed by the same thing for several hundred years. Harry opened the egg underwater. The wailing and shrieking became, underwater, a voice. Several voices harmonized, the eerie, beautiful choral quality of sound produced in water, not quite human and more than human, the voices of the merpeople in the lake. The song resolved into words. Come seek us where our voices sound, we cannot sing above the ground, and while you're searching, ponder this, we've taken what you'll sorely miss. An hour long you'll have to look and recover what we took. But past an hour the prospect's black, too late it's gone, it won't come back. He sat in the water for a long time after the song ended. What you'll sorely miss, he thought about Hermione, about Ron. About the people who had become, through no plan of his own and every instinct he possessed, the essential fabric of his life. He thought about what it would feel like to surface from the lake after an hour and find that he'd been too slow. He held the thought, let it be what it was. Then let it move through him and out the other side. He could breathe underwater, that was the problem to solve. Not the emotional weight of what might be taken, that was the tournament's attempt to control him through fear, and he'd been refusing to be controlled by fear since he was 11. The problem was the breath. He thought about Stormbreaker and what it did in the vicinity of water. He hadn't tested this specifically. He tested whether fire, basic combat, but water was different. The lake was different, he thought, I'll find out. January arrived, and with it something Harry had been half expecting and half dreading. The Daily Prophet story that put together the campsite attack. The first task and Stormbreaker into a single piece under the headline. Boy WHO wields weapon of GODS. Ministry silent on ASGARDIAN artifact AT Hogwarts. The piece was better researched than anything the Prophet had previously managed about Harry, which said less about the quality of the journalism and more about the fact that the reporter, a name he didn't recognize, had clearly spoken to someone with actual information. The Asgardian categorization was accurate. The description of the campsite was mostly accurate. The framing of the ministry's silence as suspicious was, Harry thought, probably correct. What the piece got wrong was the subtext. The headline's weapon of gods missed the specific point Hermione had identified in the text, that it wasn't a weapon of gods in the sense of belonging to the divine, but a weapon that measured the same qualities the old stories associated with divinity, worth, not power. The two things were entirely different. The class looked at Harry. Harry looked at McGonagall. And if it stays a request, he said. Then it remains a request, McGonagall said, with the clipped finality of someone who has said what needs to be said. He went to Dumbledore that evening. The headmaster's office was in its evening mode, quieter, the instruments ticking softly, Fawkes making the low, warm sound he made when Harry was there. Dumbledore was at his desk with a letter in front of him that was probably Fudge's, and his expression had the particular quality of someone who has been managing a complicated situation and has decided the complication is about to require direct communication. Harry, he said, sit. Harry sat, Stormbreaker against the chair. Cornelius, Dumbledore said, is frightened. Of me, Harry said, or of the axe. Of what you represent, Dumbledore said, a power operating outside the ministry's jurisdiction or understanding. That is deeply uncomfortable for a man whose sense of safety is derived from institutional control. He looked at Harry over the glasses. He will escalate this, not immediately, but before the year ends there will be a directive rather than a request. And when there is, Harry said, Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, the ministry does not have the authority to confiscate a weapon that has chosen its wielder. There is precedent in wizarding law. The Magical Objects Act of 1709 specifically exempts bonded objects from ministry seizure without evidence of criminal use. He paused. I suggest you familiarize yourself with that section. Harry looked at him. You've already done the research. I've done a great deal of research since August, Dumbledore said. Something in his voice shifted, quieter, more honest, the performed arrangement dropping its scaffolding for a moment. Harry, I want to tell you something that I should have told you some time ago. Harry waited. I have made decisions, Dumbledore said, about your life, about your path, which I believed were correct and which I still believe were motivated by the right things, that were not mine to make unilaterally. You were a child. I was in a position of power, and I chose what I thought was necessary over what was honest. He looked at his hands. Stormbreaker did not choose you despite what has been done to you. I believe it chose you partly because of it. Because a child who has been failed by adults in authority and has remained, as you have remained, intact and generous and willing, he stopped. That is not a quality I manufactured with my plans, that is a quality you built yourself. The office was quiet. Harry sat with the words. He felt something complicated and honest, the kind of feeling that doesn't resolve into simple categories. Gratitude was in there, and the specific sorrow of acknowledging that something could be true and also insufficient. He thought about Privet Drive and the cupboard under the stairs and 13 summers of being told he was nothing, and the fact that none of those summers had been necessary and all of them had been permitted by a man who loved him in his own complicated way. He didn't say all of that. He didn't need to. The quality of his silence communicated it, and Dumbledore heard it and accepted it without defense. "All right," Harry said finally. "All right," Dumbledore said. He left. In the corridor, he stood for a moment with his hand on the cold stone wall and breathed. Then he picked up Stormbreaker, adjusted it in his grip, and walked back toward Gryffindor Tower. The second task fell on a morning in February when the lake was the color of old pewter, and the sky had the flat, low quality of a day that hasn't decided what to do with itself yet. The other champions were at the bank. Harry looked at the water. He'd tested Stormbreaker in the lake 3 times since Christmas, early in the mornings when the grounds were empty. What he'd found was something he didn't have a framework for beyond it works, a quality in the axe near water that was different from the weather sensitivity, deeper, older. Not control exactly, more like harmony. The lake was a system like the atmosphere, and Stormbreaker gave him access to the conversation the system was having with itself. He could breathe. Not through any charm, not through gillyweed, he'd tried those, had them as fallback, but because Stormbreaker, when held below the surface, created something around him that was neither air nor water but had the properties of both. A margin. A space where the conditions shifted. He knew what had been taken. He'd had a dream in January, specific and clear, the kind of dream that isn't really a dream, and he'd seen them. Ron and Hermione and Cho and someone he didn't know well on the floor of the lake with the merpeople, breathing the strange magic of that deep water, sleeping in the cold safety of whatever enchantment the merpeople had cast. He knew the way, he knew what he needed. Bagman fired the cannon. Harry walked into the lake, not ran. Walked with the specific deliberateness of someone who is not performing calmness but actually is calm. And the water came up to his knees, his waist, his chest, and he held Stormbreaker at his side with the blade downward and the markings flaring to life in the pewter-cold water. That impossible color transformed in the lake water to something greener and deeper, and then he was under. The lake was vast. That was always the first thing, the scale of it. The columns of light coming down from the surface. The darkness in the deeps that wasn't hostile but was absolute, the way the world reorganized itself around the fact that this was not a human place. He moved through it and breathed and felt Stormbreaker warm in the cold, and the axe was doing something he'd started to understand in December, resonating. Sending something out into the water and receiving information back, the way a bat navigates by sound. He found the merpeople village in 32 minutes. It was extraordinary in the way of things that have no human reference point. Not beautiful exactly, or not only beautiful. Real, in the way of places that have been inhabited for a long time and carry the weight of that inhabitation. The stone structures, the cold light, the merpeople who emerged from the surrounding water and regarded him with the specific wariness of beings encountering something they haven't encountered before. He saw them, the 4 figures, tethered, sleeping, and found Hermione and Ron among them and felt the specific relief of confirmation. They were all right. Asleep, cold, but all right. The chief merperson, massive, with weed-gray hair and a spear, moved forward and made the underwater sound that Harry had heard from the egg, the choral quality of merpeople's speech below water. He couldn't understand it precisely, but the intention was clear enough. One person, one to save. That was the rule. Harry looked at the chief, he looked at the 4 figures, he looked at Stormbreaker in his hand. "No," he said, and his voice underwater was wrong but present. "I'm taking them all." The chief raised the spear. Harry raised the axe. They looked at each other for a long moment in the cold green light of the lake floor. Then the chief lowered the spear. It was not defeat. Harry read it correctly as something more considered, the assessment of a being who has encountered something unexpected and made a decision about it. There was a quality in the merperson's expression that translated across species. Interesting. Harry cut the tethers on all 4. He brought them all up. It took the full hour and 12 minutes over, which cost him points he'd calculate later and didn't particularly care about. What it cost him that he did care about was the cold. The lake in February was a sustained physical assault on every biological system he had. And by the time he surfaced with all 4 people and dragged them to the bank, he was shaking in a specific, deep way that said the body had given everything it had and was now requesting a serious conversation about choices. Hermione surfaced spluttering and grabbed his arm with both hands and said, "Harry," in the voice she used when she was frightened and furious and relieved simultaneously, which was a very specific voice he'd heard before. "Here," he said, "everyone's here." She looked at him, looked at the other 3, looked at him again. "You went over time," she said. "Yes. Points. I don't care about the points, Hermione." She looked at him for a moment with water streaming down her face and her hair ruined and the cold making her shake. And her expression did the thing it sometimes did when she was feeling something she didn't have the right category for, not quite crying, not quite not. "You are the most infuriatingly brave person I have ever met in my life," she said. "Thank you," he said. "It wasn't a compliment exactly, I know," he said. She laughed. Brief and genuine and cold, and then Madame Pomfrey descended with blankets and pepper-up potion, and the conversation became a different kind of conversation. And Harry sat on the bank with a blanket around his shoulders and the fire of the pepper-up in his chest and Stormbreaker lying across his knees, and watched the lake settle back into its pewter calm. He looked at the scores when they went up. Tied for first with Crumb on points total. Crumb caught his eye from across the bank and gave him the single nod that was Crumb's entire emotional vocabulary, and Harry returned it. He thought about the merpeople chief lowering the spear. About the look in those ancient eyes, that quality of interesting, the recognition of something unexpected. He thought about what Hermione had found in the archive texts, those who have been emptied and did not fill the emptiness with bitterness. He thought about not taking the single person he was entitled to, because the other three needed taking too. He thought about worthiness not being about power or achievement or the score, but about the specific quality of a choice made when the choice costs you something. The lake was quiet and pewter gray and cold, and the February sky sat flat and undecided above it, and the school was beginning its slow movement from the bank back toward the castle and warmth and lunch, and Harry sat with his blanket and his axe and his steadily warming chest and thought, I'd make it again. Same choice every time. That was the weight of worth. It wasn't light, but it was entirely his. Chapter 5, Before the Maze. Spring arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, gradually and then all at once. The snow retreating from the grounds in patches, the lake losing its pewter quality and beginning to catch light again, the trees at the edge of the forbidden forest putting out the first tentative green of buds that hadn't committed yet. The air smelled different. Harry noticed it the morning after the second task, standing on the Quidditch pitch before anyone else was up, and thought, 3 months. 3 months to the third task. 3 months to whatever was waiting at the end of this tournament. He'd been thinking about Moody. Not constantly, he had a tournament to navigate and a school year running alongside it, and the Ministry's increasingly pointed letters to Dumbledore, which Dumbledore had been forwarding to Harry with his own annotations in the margins. Annotations which were simultaneously informative and a masterclass in diplomatic euphemism. Fudge had escalated from request to formal inquiry, which according to the 1709 Magical Objects Act meant exactly nothing unless Harry used Stormbreaker to commit a crime, which he had no intention of doing. But the escalation itself told him something about what the Ministry was afraid of, and what the Ministry was afraid of was, as usual, not the actual threat, but Moody. He'd been careful all year, careful in the specific way of someone who is building a picture slowly, not wanting to disturb the subject before the picture was complete. He'd noticed things and filed them, Moody's magical eye tracking Stormbreaker specifically, with the directional attention of someone who had been given a specific brief regarding it. The hip flask Moody drank from constantly and exclusively, which Harry had identified through Hermione's research as consistent with someone maintaining a polyjuice regimen. The taste of the potion necessitated heavy masking, and Moody's apparent fondness for whatever was in that flask had the quality of need rather than preference. The slight overperformance in moments that should have been casual, the specific theatrical quality of Moody's paranoia, which was famous and documented and real, and which someone impersonating Moody would logically lean on heavily as camouflage. And the warmth in Stormbreaker, every time. Directional pointing, the compass quality that Hermione had identified as the weapon's response to the gap between what something presented and what it was. He'd told Hermione after Christmas, shown her his notes, actual written notes, because this was the kind of thing that required more than memory. She'd read them twice without saying anything, which with Hermione was diagnostic of how serious she was taking it. Then she'd said, the trunk. The trunk, he'd confirmed, they had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan, and it involved several things that would get them in significant trouble if it went wrong. But it was a plan that followed from the evidence to its necessary conclusion in the way Hermione liked her plans to follow, which made it structurally satisfying even if the content was alarming. What they needed was timing. The right moment when whoever was inside Moody's face would be absent from the office long enough for Harry and Hermione to get in, get to the trunk, and get what they needed. That moment arrived in April, 7 weeks before the final task, in the form of a mandatory staff meeting called by Dumbledore in response to Fudge's latest communication from the Ministry. All staff, Dumbledore had been explicit. The portraits confirmed it to Harry when he asked, which required exactly the right approach to the portrait of the fat friar in the East Corridor who was both talkative and easily flattered. 2 hours. The meeting would last 2 hours minimum, possibly longer. Harry told Ron first. They were in the common room after dinner, late, most of the Gryffindors drifted up to bed. Ron listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was one of the things Harry appreciated most about him when it mattered. He knew when to be quiet and let the information arrive at its own pace. When Harry finished, Ron was quiet for a moment. Then you've known since December. Since the campsite really, Harry said, but December was when it became concrete. Ron looked at him. The look had several layers, but the top one, the one that mattered most, was the one that said, "I'm with you." "What do you need me to do?" "Keep watch," Harry said. "You know the south corridor faster than either of us. If anyone comes before we're out, two-way mirror," Ron said immediately. He was already thinking logistically, which Harry had been counting on. "Fred and George left me one from their supplies, I'll ping you." "Good." Hermione arrived from the stairs with her bag over her shoulder and her research expression on, the one that meant she'd been thinking about this specifically for the last several hours and had conclusions. She sat down, looked at both of them. "We're doing this tonight," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "Ron knows everything." "Ron knows everything," Ron confirmed. She put her bag on the table. "Then here's what I found this afternoon." She pulled out a folded piece of parchment covered in her handwriting. "The 7th lock on Moody's trunk. The standard use of a 7-lock trunk is sequential access. Each lock opens a different chamber, with the 7th being the deepest and most secured. The 7th lock will have its own specific countercharm." But she looked at Harry. "A 7-lock trunk that's being used to hold someone rather than store objects will have a fundamental magical weakness. The occupant creates residual magic, their own ambient signature, that builds up inside the sealed chamber. After months, that signature becomes detectable from outside. You can sense who's in there," Harry said. "Not sense exactly, but the magical signature will have a specific frequency. And if Stormbreaker responds to truth," she tapped the parchment, "it should respond to the real Aleister Moody inside that trunk, the real person behind the false face, so to speak, the source of what's being hidden." Harry looked at her. "You want me to use Stormbreaker to locate the 7th chamber?" "I want the axe to do what the texts say it does," she said. "And I want to have a Lohomora modified for a 7-stage lock system, which I've been working on since January and am reasonably confident about." She paused. "Reasonably." "Hermione, fairly confident," she said. "The theoretical basis is sound." Ron made a noise. "The theoretical basis," she said firmly, "is entirely sound." They went at 9:15, when the staff corridor was empty, and the meeting in Dumbledore's office had been running for 40 minutes. Ron took the south end. Harry and Hermione went up the back staircase that passed the staff bathrooms, a route that Hermione had mapped using a combination of the Marauder's map borrowed from Harry and her own 3 years of detailed mental cartography of the castle. Moody's office door was locked with the standard staff enchantment, plus 2 additional wards that Hermione dismantled, with the focused attention of someone who has been preparing for exactly this. The second ward produced a soft flash of blue light that made both of them freeze, 2 seconds, 3, and then it faded and the door opened. Inside was what Harry had seen glimpses of from the corridor over the year, the many-eyed sneakoscopes on the desk, the collection of dark detectors that twitched and spun at their entry, the scarred surface of the desk itself, and against the far wall the trunk. 7 locks. 1 open, Moody's things for the school year, normal enough. The next 5 closed. The 7th at the base, barely visible under the bulk of the trunk itself. Harry crouched in front of it, held Stormbreaker near the trunk. The axe went immediately, pointedly warm. Not the readiness warmth, not the weather warmth. The specific directional warmth he'd been calling the compass, but stronger than he'd felt it all year, strong enough that the markings on the blade brightened considerably, the impossible color filling the room. "There," he said. Hermione crouched beside him. She had her wand out and was doing something complicated with her left hand while her wand traced a pattern he couldn't follow. He felt the magic of it, different from Stormbreaker's resonance, different in quality but not incompatible, the way 2 instruments in different keys can still be in the same piece of music. She muttered something. 1 lock clicked. Another pattern. Another lock. She went through 5 more with the focused, precise efficiency of a student who has practiced a thing until the practice became reflex. And on the 7th, the small one at the base, there was a longer pause, a longer pattern, sweat visible at her hairline despite the cool of the room. The 7th lock clicked. The lid opened. Inside the deepest chamber of the trunk, which was much larger than the trunk's exterior dimensions, wizard space, Harry's mind supplied automatically, was a ladder leading down. And at the bottom of it, in a space that smelled of long confinement and stale potion and the specific, identifiable smell of an old man who had been living in extremely limited circumstances for approximately 9 months, was Aleister Moody. The real one, he was alive, that was the first thing. Alive and conscious, bleary, his one real eye finding them slowly, the magical eye gone, the empty socket where it lived, a thing Harry looked at and looked away from. He was thinner than his imposter's performance had suggested, his gray hair matted, his wooden leg gone. but alive. About bloody time, Moody said. His voice was rough and low and unmistakably real in the specific way that the imposters had never quite been. It had texture that performance couldn't manufacture. Professor Moody, Hermione said. Can you move? Are you? Give me a hand, Moody said, with the dignity of someone who is not going to accept that their current situation defines them. Harry went down the ladder and helped him up. Moody was heavier than expected, solid, beneath the months of confinement, and he leaned on Harry's shoulder with the grimness of someone who has decided that needing help and accepting help are different negotiations. The imposter, Harry said when they were back up in the office. Who is it? Moody looked at him with the one eye. My first thought when I saw the trunk opening. He was looking at Stormbreaker. His eye, the real one, had the quality of someone assessing something extraordinary with the professional objectivity of long experience. You're the Potter boy. Yes, that's the axe. Yes, Moody made a sound that might have been approval. Crouch's boy, he said. Bartemius Crouch Jr., supposed to be dead. Azkaban, then dead. Clearly not. He straightened marginally. He's been the plan all year, the tournament, the final task, getting you to the graveyard. Graveyard, Harry said. Portkey, Moody, the real Moody said. The Triwizard Cup. He'll have turned it into a portkey, takes you to a graveyard in Little Hangleton. And then, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Harry was already thinking about everything he'd assembled over 9 months, the chain of events. The plan that had accounted for everything, except Stormbreaker, except Harry himself, except the quality that the axe had identified in him and that Voldemort had presumably been studying through whatever channel existed between them, through the scar and the dreams and the 2 years of building presence. Voldemort knew about the axe. He'd had months to prepare. He hadn't cancelled the plan, which meant he'd decided the plan could accommodate it. Harry thought about what that said about Voldemort, about the intelligence of him, the cold patience of a person who doesn't rage at complications but incorporates them. Moody's assessment from the first week of term, constant vigilance, the irony of receiving that lesson from the wrong person while the real Moody had been in the bottom of a trunk. He looked at Moody. Can you walk? With help. We need to get you to Dumbledore. Yes, Moody said. He looked at Harry with his one eye. You knew how long. Since October, Harry said, roughly. Moody looked at him for a long moment. And you waited. I needed evidence. Something moved in Moody's face, not exactly respect, because Moody probably didn't give respect easily or on short acquaintance, but something adjacent. Good, he said. Evidence first, always. He adjusted his weight on Harry's shoulder. The axe helped. It pointed, Harry said. I did the rest. Moody made the sound that might have been approval again. Hermione appeared at the trunk with a cloak from Moody's own wardrobe, practical Hermione always, and draped it over his shoulders. And then the three of them moved out of the office and into the corridor. And Ron met them at the corner with wide eyes that went wider when he saw who Harry had over his shoulder. Merlin, Ron said. Later, Harry said, we need the headmaster. Dumbledore's response to finding Harry, Hermione, and Ron at his office door at 10:15 with the real Alastor Moody was, to his enormous credit, immediate and completely without theater. He took one look at the situation, said come in, and within 2 minutes had summoned Madame Pomfrey, sent a patroness to McGonagall, and conjured a chair for Moody that was genuinely comfortable rather than just functional. He looked at Harry. Tell me. Harry told him. All of it from October, the compass quality of the axe, the observations he'd filed one by one, Hermione's research into the trunk, the modified Alohomora, the 7th chamber, and Moody's identification of Crouch Jr. When he finished, Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. You have known since October, he said, not accusatory, precise. Yes, and said nothing. I had no evidence until tonight, Harry said. Suspicion without evidence about a staff member would have been taken seriously, Dumbledore said. You should know that. I do know that, Harry said. But I also know what happens to suspicion when it meets institutional resistance. The Ministry is already looking for reasons to diminish what I am and what I'm carrying. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. If I'd come to you in October saying the defense teacher is a Death Eater wearing a polyjuiced face because my axe told me so, what would the Ministry have done with that? Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Nothing useful, he admitted. Right, Harry said, so I waited until I had the trunk and the man. McGonagall arrived. Then Snape, who looked at Harry with the expression he always wore, the precise calculation of someone continually reassessing their position in a complex situation, and at Stormbreaker with something Harry suspected was the closest Snape came to genuine surprise. He said nothing about either. He accepted the situation and asked the operational questions. Where is the imposter now? Who else in the school knows? What does this tell us about the final task? Which were, Harry thought, exactly the right questions. Crouch Jr. was found in his office. Snape and McGonagall went together, which was the right choice, and Harry was kept in Dumbledore's office while this happened. He sat in his chair and waited without frustration, because he'd learned that patience was not the same as passivity. He thought about what Moody had said, the Triwizard Cup, portkey, graveyard. He thought about Voldemort waiting at the end of a portkey in a graveyard in Little Hangleton with a plan that had been running all year and a patience that was genuinely frightening. He thought about the ritual Hermione had found references to in the autumn, bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy, and about what came after the ritual. He thought, he knows I'm coming with the axe. He knows I'm not the same thing he fought in Godric's Hollow. He thought, good. The warmth in Stormbreaker was steady and even and neither readiness nor weather but something older, the quality it had when Harry was thinking clearly about something that mattered, when the thinking itself was a form of preparation. Ron was beside him, not talking, doing the thing he did when he decided that the most useful thing he could contribute was presence. Harry appreciated it exactly as much as Ron intended. Hermione had her notebook out and was writing things down in a hand that was faster than usual, which meant she was processing through her hand the way some people process through speech. He let her. Snape returned 20 minutes later with the specific expression of someone who has done an unpleasant thing competently. He's secured, he said. He had a vial of polyjuice in his pocket. We've administered Veritaserum. And, Dumbledore said, he confirms the graveyard, Snape said. Little Hangleton, the cup as portkey. The ritual requires the blood of the enemy Potter. His eyes came to Harry briefly. The Dark Lord has been building toward this since before the tournament began. The plan accounts for, he paused, for the weapon. How, Harry said. Snape looked at him. He doesn't believe it can be used to kill. The axe, in his assessment, is a weapon of honest combat. He believes you won't use it against a weakened, partially restored opponent. That your quality will make you hesitate. The room was quiet. Harry looked at Stormbreaker. He thought about what Voldemort had assessed. That worthiness meant restraint, meant mercy, meant a 14-year-old boy who would flinch from hitting someone who was down. He thought about what the axe had actually shown him over 9 months of carrying it and listening to it. That worthiness wasn't softness. It was precision. It was hitting exactly what needed hitting and nothing else, but when something needed hitting, hitting it. He's wrong, Harry said. Snape looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said quietly. I rather think he is. The days between Crouch's exposure and the final task had a specific quality that Harry recognized, the quality of time becoming purposeful, of every hour carrying extra weight because the hours were numbered in a way they hadn't been before. Not dread exactly, something more useful than dread, the school knew by morning. Not the complete story, not Crouch specifically, not the full chain of events, but the outline. The defense teacher had been removed from his post, there had been an incident, investigations were ongoing. The Daily Prophet ran 2 pieces in 3 days, both of them missing the point in different directions. Fudge arrived on the Thursday with 2 assistants, and a face that communicated a man who has been told something he fundamentally does not want to be true and is looking for a way to not believe it. He came to Harry's defense class, temporarily being covered by McGonagall, who had the expression of someone who had taught every subject in the school at some point and found none of them particularly surprising, and took Harry aside in the corridor with the specific manner of a man who is used to institutional conversations with children and expects the institutional dynamic to hold. Potter, he said, I'm going to need a full account of how you came to what you claim to have found. Harry looked at him. With respect, Minister, you're going to want to speak with Dumbledore. I've spoken with Dumbledore, Fudge said. I'm speaking with you. Then Dumbledore will have told you what I told him, Harry said. The report is complete. The evidence is in the trunk, which has been secured. Crouch Jr. is in the office, also secured, and has given a full account under Veritaserum. He paused. Is there a specific part of that you'd like me to elaborate on? Fudge looked at him with the expression of a man being managed by a 14-year-old and processing his feelings about it. The weapon, he said. You used it to. I used it to open a trunk, Harry said. In the service of rescuing a kidnapped ministry-licensed Auror, he held Fudge's eyes steadily. Under the 1709 Magical Objects Act, Section 4, a bonded object used in the service of rescue or defense of innocent life is specifically exempted from the ministry's investigative jurisdiction. He paused. I read the section you suggested might apply. Fudge went slightly red. I didn't suggest, Professor Dumbledore did, Harry said, and it's in the Act. The Minister for Magic looked at Harry Potter for a long moment with the complex expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it, and is working out how to reconstitute his dignity. Then he said the matter of the axe remains under review. Of course, Harry said pleasantly. Is there anything else, Minister? There wasn't. He found Ron in the corridor afterwards and Ron said, you quoted ministry law at the Minister for Magic. Hermione found the section, Harry said. She's going to be insufferable about this. She's already been insufferable about this, Harry said. Since January. Right, Ron said with the tone of someone who finds this information neither surprising nor unwelcome. So, the final task. Yes. And after, Harry thought about after, he'd been thinking about it with increasing specificity. Moody had told him what he knew, the graveyard, the ritual, what came after the ritual. A body, a restored Dark Lord. The thing that Harry had spent 4 years existing in the shadow of, defined by, carrying the scar of, coming back in a form that was real and present and no longer the distant threat of rumor and dread. He'd thought about how he felt about this and arrived at something he hadn't expected: readiness. Not excitement, not aggression. The specific readiness of someone who has been preparing for something for a long time and can feel it approaching and is not running toward it or away from it, but simply standing in the right place with the right things. After Harry said, "We deal with what's there," Ron looked at him. "With the axe." "With everything," Harry said. "The axe, my wand, 4 years of education, the fact that I've faced him before and I'm still here." He looked at Ron, "And the fact that I know what I'm walking into this time." Ron was quiet for a moment. "Last time," he said, "you didn't know anything. First year, the mirror, Quirrell, you just went." "Yes." "Second year, the chamber, you went with a sword you'd never used and a bird, also yes." "Third year, the Dementors, Ron." "I'm saying," Ron said, "that your record for going into things without preparation and coming out the other side is," he searched for the word, "frankly amazing, and now you're prepared and you've had months to practice and you've got that." He nodded at Stormbreaker. So, Harry said, "So you're going to be fine," Ron said, with a directness that stripped all the hedging out of the sentence and left only the essential core of it. Harry looked at him. "Thank you." "Don't mention it," Ron said. "I mean that literally. If you tell Hermione I said something reassuring without her prompting me, I'll deny it." Harry almost smiled. Almost. It got the better of him. Hermione found him in the library the evening before the final task. He was sitting alone at the back table, the one they'd claimed as theirs in first year and had never entirely relinquished, with Stormbreaker across his knees and a piece of parchment in front of him that was meant to be an essay on transfiguration and had been blank for 20 minutes. She sat across from him. She had her notebook. She set it on the table but didn't open it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. And I want you to let me say all of it before you respond." "All right," he said again. She looked at the axe, then at him. She had the expression she wore when she was about to be honest about something she'd been thinking about for a long time, the kind of honest that required the setup because it was going to be more personal than her usual register. "When I was 11, she said, "and I came to Hogwarts, I knew more than almost every other student in terms of book knowledge. I'd read everything. I was ready for it theoretically." She paused. "What I wasn't ready for was people, the actual human part. I was bossy, and I was lonely, and I was afraid that if I stopped being correct about everything, I wouldn't have any value at all." She looked at her hands. "And then on Halloween there was a troll, and you and Ron came back for me even though you had no reason to, and I didn't know what to do with that." She looked up at him. "I've never told you this." "No," he said. 4 years, she said. 4 years of coming back for each other and going forward for each other, and I've been thinking because I think about things, it's what I do about tomorrow, about what comes after the maze. Moody told you, we all know what it is." She paused. "And I want to say that whatever is in that graveyard, whatever he's built and planned and prepared, it didn't account for the last 4 years. It accounted for a boy who survived as a baby. It accounted for a problem to be solved. It did not account for the person you actually are. The person that," she stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "The person that Axe chose." Harry looked at her. "I'm not saying this to make you feel ready," she said. "I think you're already ready. I'm saying this because you deserve to hear it, because nobody has said it enough. You are, Harry, you are exactly what Stormbreaker says you are. Not because of the scar or the prophecy or anything that was done to you, because of what you've done, what you keep choosing." Her voice was very steady, which took visible effort. "And I am so grateful, I am genuinely grateful that you came back for me in a bathroom when you had no reason to." The library was empty around them, the last light of the evening coming through the high windows, the shelves of books doing what shelves of books do, existing with the quiet authority of accumulated knowledge. Somewhere a torch crackled. Harry looked at Hermione. This person who had been impossible at 11 and had become, through the specific alchemy of shared danger and genuine love, someone he trusted with every part of himself. Hermione, who had found references to dying stars and what they chose. Who had opened a 7-lock trunk with a modified Alohomora while her hands were entirely steady. Who researched things nobody else thought to research and told him things nobody else thought to tell him and was almost always right and was honest enough to say fairly confident instead of definitely when she wasn't. "I came back because you're my friend," he said, "and then you became my best friend, and that's," he paused. "That's the answer to every why. You and Ron are the answer to every why." She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened her notebook with a decisive motion that meant she was done being emotional and was returning to function. "The maze," she said. Stormbreaker in an enclosed space. I've been thinking about the weather sensitivity. In a maze, there's no open sky. You'll be working with what atmospheric pressure you can find through gaps in the hedges. I know, he said. I tested it in December. There's still signal, less than open ground but workable. The champions will all be in there simultaneously, she said. The maze will have creatures, blast-ended scroots. Probably there are 4 missing from the pens according to Hagrid, who told me accidentally while I was asking about something else. Hermione. What? I know, he said. I've been thinking about it too. She looked at him. Show me. He turned the blank transfiguration parchment over. He picked up a quill and drew, quickly from memory, the aerial shape of the maze as it had been described in the tournament guidelines. He marked entry points, the center where the cup would be placed, probable creature placement, based on what he knew of how the tournament organizers thought. He marked 2 routes, primary and contingency, that accounted for Stormbreaker's limitations in the enclosed space and leaned on what it was good at. The compass quality, which would point to the real cup versus a trap. The truth of it. Hermione looked at his drawing. She added 2 annotations with her own quill. He added 1 response. They went back and forth 3 times in silence, 2 people who had been thinking about the same problem and finding the overlap. At the end she sat back. That's good, she said. You helped, he said. Obviously, she said. I always help. Yes, he said. You do. She looked at him. Something in the frankness of his agreement, the absence of deflection, made her look away briefly, and when she looked back her expression had settled into the warm, complicated thing that was their friendship at its most honest. Come back from the graveyard, she said. That's my only requirement of you tomorrow. I intend to, he said. I know you do. She stood, gathered her notebook, adjusted her bag. I also intend to be extremely angry with you if you don't. That's very encouraging, Harry said. Good, it's meant to be. She walked toward the library door and then stopped, turned back. Harry, the worthiness, the texts say the axe doesn't just reflect what you are, it grows with you. It's been with you 9 months and it has been learning you the way you've been learning it. She paused. Whatever Voldemort planned for, he planned for the Harry Potter who arrived at Hogwarts in September, not the Harry Potter standing at the end of this year. She met his eyes. There's a difference. He thought about that after she left. He sat in the library alone with Stormbreaker across his knees and the evening settling into dark around him, the torches brightening automatically as the light failed, the books doing their quiet accumulating thing on their shelves. He thought about 9 months of learning, not the axe learning him though that too, but him learning himself through the specific mirrors that Stormbreaker held up. He thought about the garden in Surrey, the campsite fire and the rain. The dragon and the thunder that had come from nothing, the lake and the choice to take all 4. The trunk and the 7 locks and the man inside it and the conversation with Dumbledore that followed. He thought about worthiness as a process rather than a destination. Not a quality you possessed once and kept unchanged, but something you built through choices, and that was therefore never finished and never final, which was either terrifying or the most honest thing he'd ever understood about what it meant to be alive. He picked up Stormbreaker, felt the warmth of it. The familiar weight, the familiar resonance. The markings cycling through their impossible color in the near dark of the empty library. He thought about a graveyard in Little Hangleton and a ritual and what came after a ritual, and about standing in front of something that had been trying to destroy him since before he could walk, and about the fact that he was going. Not because he had to, not because the tournament's binding contract would force him to touch the cup. He was going because this was the thing that needed doing and he was the person who could do it, and those 2 things had been true since Godric's Hollow and would be true until they were resolved, one way or the other. He thought, not afraid. The warmth in Stormbreaker pulsed once. Slow, certain, not afraid, ready, he stood, gathered himself. Walked out of the library and through the castle and up to Gryffindor Tower, past the portrait of the fat lady who gave him a long, specific look and then swung open without asking for the password, and through the common room where Ron was at the table with his chess set and Ginny was reading in front of the fire and the ordinary hum of the tower at night was doing what it always did. Ron looked up, looked at him, didn't ask. Harry sat down across from the chess set. 1 game, he said. Ron's expression did the thing where the complicated feelings resolved into something simpler. White or black? Black, Harry said. Brave, Ron said, and moved his first piece. They played until nearly midnight, and Ron won, which was the natural order of things, and Harry didn't mind because the game was not the point. The point was the common room at night, and the fire, and the 2 friends on either side of a chess board, and the ordinary, extraordinary, specific warmth of being somewhere you belong. Tomorrow was the maze. And after the maze was the graveyard. And in the graveyard was the thing they'd all been building toward, one choice at a time, 1 month at a time, since the summer a star had fallen into a garden in Surrey and something vast and old and patient had looked at a 14-year-old boy and decided, yes, finally.